Oh, thank you. All right. It appears to be time. Let's go ahead and bring the November 19th meeting of the Board of Harbor Commissioners to order. Mary, if you would call roll.
Frank Kelly.
Here.
Will Anakushin. Here. Betsy Kramer. Ken Owen. Bill Spicer.
All right. Mr. Bridley, do we have any changes to the agenda?
Mr. Chair, we have no changes this evening.
All right. At this time, we would take comment from the public on any item which is not on our agenda. Okay. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of September the 17th?
Also moved.
Is there a second? I'll second it. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Minutes are approved. The director's report.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. On council items that have gone since our last meeting, we've had our changes to the municipal code that have gone on to City Council, and those have been approved along with the mooring standards for the east of the wharf mooring area. That resolution has been approved, which gives the authority to the Harbor Commission to set those standards in the future. The report this evening that I would like to focus on is the recruitment effort for the Board of Harbor Commission. As all of you are, I'm sure, are aware, as part of the municipal election, the voters did choose to vote in favor of expanding Measure D, which was a measure to expand the Harbor Commission number from 5 to 7. As part of that, there also was the opportunity to have one of the 7-member board elected or appointed as a non-city resident. So that has been approved. Currently, the City Council is in the recruitment process for all boards and advisory commissions of the city, including the Harbor Commission. And we currently have 4 applicants that are interviewing in front of the City Council. City Council will make their final decisions involving the appointment process on December 15th, at which time they'll go down the list of all the boards and commissions and begin appointing individuals that have gone through the interview process. So I would expect that by the January meeting, we will expand the board and welcome the new appointees that the City Council select. And like I say, there are 4 applicants for the 3 positions. As you all know, Ken Owen's term is up at the end of the year in December, and Ken is elected not to continue, and so there'll be that vacancy with the 2 new positions created by the passing of Measure D. And I think that's it. We'll cover as part of staff and commission items later at the end of the agenda our plans for the December meeting. We do have a couple tentative agenda items for that meeting. Okay.
Were you going to cover the tentative agenda items for December?
Carl would like to potentially go through the Phase 2 design contract. As you know, we've started the construction for the Phase 1 portion, and at the same time, piggybacking on that, we'll start Phase 2, and then we may have ready the Santa Barbara Sailing Center lease agreement, which the property management folks are working on.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bridley. Any comments or questions from the Commission? Facilities Management Report.
Good evening, Chairman Kelly and Commissioners. I have 4 items this evening, but I'm just going to report on 2 for the sake of brevity. We have a pretty full agenda this evening, but when I conclude, you can ask me questions about any of them if they come up. The first item I'd like to discuss this evening is some recent fire activity we had on Stearns Wharf at 3 a.m. on October 29th. Several fires erupted. Passing harbor, a CHP officer on Cabrillo Boulevard spotted a fire at the foot of the wharf and immediately contacted Harbor Patrol and the fire department. They managed to put that fire out and move out to the wharf, where there were several fires by the Harbor Restaurant, the trash enclosure, all the way out to Moby Dick's restaurant. Most of them were trash can fires and weren't very significant, but 2 of them caused quite a bit of damage. One fire burned the southwest corner of the Harbor Restaurant, burning quite a bit of the siding, and it got so hot it caused the windows to burst and melted an awning right above there. About 9 deck boards had to be replaced. One of the benches was charred, and the Harbor Restaurant owner, John Scott, is currently effecting repairs to the rest of that building. More significant damage was caused to a trash enclosure adjacent to our maintenance shop. A couple telecommunication cabinets were burned. We had to refeed all the fiber optic cable, and most significantly, the transformer you see here was damaged significantly and had to be replaced. SCE crews, Southern California Edison crews, got on scene immediately at about 4:30 in the morning and determined that it would need to be replaced, although it was still providing service. At 9 a.m., they showed up with a brand new transformer and crews, and they swapped it out in about 4 hours, which is very quick for a job of this nature, and really demonstrates Edison's commitment to keeping power up on Stearns Wharf and realizing how significant fire can be and how dangerous it can be. We continue to inspect the wharf on a regular basis. We have training exercises with Harbor Patrol and the fire department, and my staff inspects the electrical conduit on a regular basis. This fire was considered to be an arson set fire. They haven't determined exactly who did it, and we haven't received the report yet. So it was a bit of a freak, an uncommon occurrence, and the infrastructure out there is pretty solid, and we feel it's reliable service to all the tenants out there, and we got them back up and running in record time. Unfortunate event, but not too bad consequences. Today began construction of the Marina One Replacement Project, Phase 1. The landside construction began today, which is behind our building. That shows the 132 building. And the first phase of construction is to reinstall or install new electrical conduit and electrical feed to Marina One through some trenches behind our building, and then install some submarine cables under what we refer to as fish float south out to some new switchgear on the main headwalk. This will feed all of Marina One. This work will be done in about a month and a half. We'll install a brand new transformer behind our building on first week in January. And then in February, we'll start the waterside construction. Bellingham Marine Incorporated is the contractor, the subcontractor building the floats themselves. They'll start fabrication in February and deliver the floats in 5 different one-week sections. We're going to convene some harbor community meetings probably in January. We're going to detail a vessel displacement plan because several vessels will be displaced during construction over the course of the 2 months or so it'll take. And we'll have all the details probably in January and hopefully be able to give everybody advanced warning. This concludes my facilities report this evening. Like I said, I have a couple other items that I'd be happy to answer any questions about.
Thank you, Carl. Any questions for Carl?
I think I missed part of it. I don't know if you covered...
Excuse me, hold on. No, that wasn't addressed to the general public. That was addressed to the commission. Any commission questions for Carl on his report? Commissioner Anakuchin.
What are the other 2 topics?
Briefly, we had an accident with our passenger loading ramp on Stearns Wharf. It failed and fell into the water, which we repaired the following week. We identified sort of a problem area that we've secured and improved and upgraded so that that won't fail again. That was sort of a dangerous situation. And the other one was a West Beach project, sand management project. Goleta Beach is an eroding beach, and they have a beach nourishment project coming up, and we're considering taking some excess sand from West Beach and transporting it up to Goleta Beach as part of this beach nourishment project. That project is developing, and we'll probably be coming back to the commission with some details on it. This was sort of advanced notice for the commissioners that it's coming up, so I provide a little bit of background.
All right. Commissioner Owen?
Just on that, would that still be Goleta basically buying our sand?
It's not exactly. It's FEMA funded. It's hazard mitigation money through FEMA that had already been secured prior to the recent Coastal Commission decision on the Goleta Beach project. It's something that was sort of in the mill, and they've had several beach nourishment projects just in anticipation of large winter waves and whatnot. So they're not buying our sand so much as they're helping us with a potential future project.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Owen, we're of the opinion if people want West Beach sand, we're more than willing to give it to them. It doesn't bode well for us to figure out ways to get rid of it. If somebody else wants it and they'll come and take it and it costs us virtually nothing, then we'll work with them to facilitate that.
That's a good attitude.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Commissioner Kramer.
I'm just pointing out, I think the gentleman in back there is preparing a speaker slip for this. I don't know if he...
Okay, well, take it when he brings it up to the front.
There he's got it.
Is it on this point, sir?
Well, like I said, I missed a little bit of it, and I'm not quite sure if it's totally on that point, but it has to do with basically your waterworks and septic. Was that a point that's going to be covered, or?
No, that's not anything that we're covering this evening. So if there's time, I'll come back to it at the very end.
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
is there any reason why we can't just go back to public comment for this gentleman?
Just because the only reason I wouldn't, Ken, is because it's going to be a very long meeting this evening. So,
Well, why don't we ask him to keep it short?
I'm going to ask him, since he wasn't here at the very beginning, if he doesn't mind waiting. I'm going to move right along, and we'll grab him at the end. Okay. All right. If there are no more comments on the facilities management report, we'll dash off to the harbor operations report.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. Like Carl, because we have a long agenda, I'm going to concentrate on two primary issues, the rest of which are contained in your staff report, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about those. As you may recall, on September 19th, Friday, September 19th, we conducted our reverse 911 test at the waterfront in cooperation with the Sheriff's Department. We had what we would call a success rate of 82%. Out of 2,600 calls, that means 82% of them, over 2,100, were either picked up or went to answering machine in complete form. And the other 18% went to faxes, were either blocked, were timed out, or were busy. And those 18% we are working to reconcile so we can improve our database and get that up to the Sheriff's Department. Also, we're working with the sheriffs on a semi-annual update to our database with them for reverse 911 because the names in our marina management system and contact numbers for slip permittees change quite often in terms of who registered boat owners are, who might be a new slip permittee, who might be a new boat owner in a slip and slip transfers and what have you. So because that's sort of a dynamic situation, we're working with them on our best attempt to keep that updated and contemporary. So we can consider that a success, preliminarily at least. And we followed it up, as you well know, with a survey to our boaters and our tenants. And as of November 1st, we'd received, I believe it was 153 responses. Since then, we received another 12. It's about a 14% return. It's not unexpected for this kind of survey. At the risk of assuming the unassumable, I'd like to think that most of the folks who didn't return their surveys were satisfied or had received the 911 call and were satisfied with the service. The results of the sort of cumulative results of the surveys that were returned are contained as an attachment to your report. I won't go into that in detail other than to tell you that we have met with the Sheriff's Office and reviewed these. There are some salient points in here that we're looking at possibly adding to the 911 reverse 911 message, including a time and date of the call of the message. That's one of the bullet points you see on here, which we mutually with the sheriffs thought was a good recommendation. So if somebody picks it off an answering machine, they'll know the time of the call. And also you can see a list of concerns that people had relative to when they think 911 calls should be issued. We have our perspective on which are appropriate, meet that threshold, and which might not. And the ones that do, I think, are reflected by the high percentage of those who thought so themselves in their surveys, like a tsunami and tidal wave threat, or a high wind or major weather alert or storm or hurricane. But the ones that don't are of equal importance to us, because those are part of the ideas we want to begin to fold into phase 2 of this program, which begins later this year and certainly in earnest the beginning of 2010, and that is to investigate and research potential information distribution systems that are of a non-emergency nature. As an example there, I put the electrical outage, or don't forget to sign up for the Parade of Lights. We have a lot of delicate things to balance. We don't want to burden people with calls and, oh, it's the waterfront click, and they don't listen. But at the same time, we want to sort of pick, I wouldn't say pick our battles, pick our issues that we want to inform people on. But now that I've mentioned the Parade of Lights, I will add really quickly, don't forget it's December 13th, Sunday. We invite the entire community down, which for what we think is a wonderful holiday celebration at the waterfront. That's Sunday the 13th. At the waterfront, beginning 3 p.m. with the Santa's Village and 5:30 with the parade. The other thing I wanted to share with you was an update on the Marine Life Protection Act. We've been talking about this on a near monthly basis for about a year, and we had really a seminal meeting between the regional stakeholder group. You remember I sit on that as a Ports and Harbors representative. These are 64 people appointed by the Secretary of Resources to inform a blue ribbon task force that's appointed by the governor that in turn makes its recommendation for marine protected area closures along the Southern California coast to the California Fish and Game Commission, which ultimately makes the decision on where those should be and how those geographies are shaped. The meeting in October was really something to see. We're used to public comment, but there was a day when there were 1,200 speakers who came to the microphone. It started at 9 in the morning, and it went past midnight. And at the midnight hour, it was down to 15 seconds for people who had waited 15 hours to speak. It was the best of times and the worst of the times for the public process, and it was really quite something to see. But on the upside of it, it was remarkable to see how many people turned out and had their say on this very, very pivotal and controversial environmental issue, and how important it was to the members of the community in Southern California. I know as long as many members of the RSG were very moved by that. Then in November, the stakeholder group met jointly with the Blue Ribbon Task Force to discuss what would ultimately be known as the IPA, the Integrated Preferred Alternative, that the Blue Ribbon Task Force would advance to the Fish and Game Commission for their consideration. And what the task force ultimately did, out of respect for the work that the stakeholders had done over the past year, was they advanced all 3 of the work group proposals, as well as what we call the IPA. What they ultimately decided was the group of marine protected areas, the array of those that they wanted to advance to the Commission for its consideration. So they really have 4 different arrays to look at. This one is what you're looking at on the screen is the northern subregion, our region of the Integrated Preferred Alternative that was advanced to the Commission. It's reflective of a little bit of each of the 3 work groups arrays. The 3 work groups, as you may recall, one was basically mostly preservationist interest, one was mostly consumptive interests, and one was a mix. And so this Integrated Preferred Alternative, sausage making, as some of people like to refer to it, was inevitable to a point that we expected the Blue Ribbon Task Force to pick from some proposals and pick from others and try to find this extremely delicate balance between advancing the environmental objectives of the Marine Life Protection Act and not overdoing it to the point where the socioeconomic impacts to consumptive users and coastal communities was untenable. So what you see here, I have that pointer. is the northern subregion preferred alternative that the Blue Ribbon Task Force advanced, and I'll briefly go through it for you. This is still on the table for discussion. This is the beginning of a second process, and that's the one at the Fish and Game Commission. But it begins at the north end of the entire study region with Point Conception. This is the ones that are red are called state marine reserves. Those are total closed areas to all consumptive use. They're open to all non-consumptive use. This is the anchor, the northern anchor of the entire region, Southern California region's MPA system, proposed MPA system. It was on all the maps. It's a headland that was unavoidable as an obvious environmental plus. It has rocky reefs. It's a spawning area for sea bass and squid. It has tons of kelp. It's 5 or 6 miles of shoreline, about 25 square miles. It captures a huge hunk of habitat that meets science guidelines, and although there were trade-offs, there will be impacts to party boat fishing and urchin fishing and squid fishing and lobster fishing. This was really, quite frankly, a no-brainer for all sides of the issue. This had to happen, and it's an environmentally advisable. It's a wonderful area to protect. It's also the area where the two systems, the coast runs east-west here, and the rest of the coast of California essentially runs north and south. And two entire ecosystems meet here, and where you have that mixture of oceanographic elements, there's an upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich water. This makes this an extraordinarily exquisite and unique area of the Southern California coast, and there was nobody in the room that was denying the fact this was appropriate. This next yellow one is a state marine park that allows a lot of allowed uses. It's contiguous. It's called Castaya. It was an ancient of quite a bit of value to our tribal ancestors. It abuts a state park in Gaviota, and so it's contiguous here with a state park on land. It's about a mile long shore. Almost all recreational consumptive uses are allowed in there. Commercial take is not allowed in there or would not be allowed in there as proposed. This next one down here, and this was the source of quite a bit of controversy, this is Naples Reef. Naples Reef is a cherished historical area for consumptive and non-consumptive users alike. And quite frankly, this is actually blue. It shows up as a darker blue on the slide. This blue is a color representing the fact that it's a state marine conservation area, not with the full protection of the state marine reserve, but with almost the full protection, allowing spearfishing of pelagic fish and white sea bass, and the harvest of kelp. There are kelp leases in here, it allows the hand harvest and mechanical harvest of kelp, and still rates a high level of protection under science guidelines. This was a very, very valued piece of turf for consumptive interests for lobster fishermen and hook and line fishermen, pole and reel and rod and reel fishermen. Historically, some of my earliest fishing memories in this community 40 years ago were on Naples Reef. But this essentially was a trade-off for there not being any closures down around Carpinteria Reef. Given the west to east weather patterns in our channel, it was critically important for consumptive interests to maintain access to Carpinteria Reef and also to our local trawlers, our artisanal family-owned trawlers who fish that strip 1 to 3 miles off the beach between Point Arguello and Point Mugu to maintain access to very lucrative grounds off of Carpinteria. And so this was a classic trade-off as it's currently proposed and was negotiated between preservationist interests and consumptive interests to Naples is in, or Naples is out, and the Carpinteria area is still fishable and open. That's what's proposed as part of the integrated preferred alternative for the Commission's consideration. The next is Coal Oil Point. This is a very important one too. It, like Point Conception, is one of the major headlands, one of the vertebrae, if you will, in the backbone of the entire MPA proposal all the way down to the Mexican border. It also was on every map. It's a painful giveaway for a lot of interest. This is the entire Isla Vista coast and those rich kelp beds there. Tremendous environmental protection, tremendous habitat and environmental value. But at the same time, a lot of fishing, a lot of spearfishing, a lot of lobster are taken out of there. and about 15,000 students enjoy going there and spearfishing and diving and what have you. They can still do all that. They just can't take anything under the way it's currently proposed. This is mutually brokered, mutually agreed upon, and so this was not as controversial as Naples. And that's the end of what we see right now proposed in the IPA for the northern subregion. I think most of the interests I represent in terms of ports and harbors, and that is advancing the conservation values while at the same time trying best we can to protect the interests of people who go fishing from our port. There's going to be pain. We knew that from the very beginning, but this is a configuration that I, as a representative on the RSG, can live with, and this is the one for our region that will be advanced to the Fish and Game Commission. And that, with that, Mr. Chair, I would conclude my report. I'd be happy to answer any questions about any of the items on my staff report.
Right. Thank you, Mick. Commissioner Kramer.
Thank you, Mick, for that presentation. Very, very interesting. I do have one question. And what effects do you expect this to have on the commercial fishermen in the harbor? Assuming this is one of the ones that's accepted.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Kramer, I expect the following. I expect that there will be a relocation in effort. That's one of the things that we've been trying to keep as part of the discussion all along. The folks that fish at Naples, the lobster folks, will move to other areas. You may not see tremendous difference, though you may possibly see some more congestion on the grounds, and more congestion can lead to reduced catch rates, and reduced catch rates can have their effect on the resource itself. On the plus side, if one is a believer in the philosophy of marine protected areas, I think you can expect to see larval dispersion out of these areas, larger and bigger fish in these areas, hopefully some migration into adjacent areas, and in the long term, we'll see a wholesale benefit to the region environmentally.
Thank you. And I've just one other point, not a question. Congratulations on being named Harbor Master of the Year again.
Thank you.
All right. Are there any further comments? Oh, Commissioner Spicer.
One quick question on a different topic. The abandoned vessel bill, if you could just touch on that briefly. I've got some vocal constituents that are very interested in that, and if you could tell us what you anticipate this means for us.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Spicer, thank you for asking. This bill, basically, we've had an abandoned boat problem in Santa Barbara for decades, and if they don't wash up on the beach, the worst of the worst, of course, is all I'm talking about. If they don't wash up in the beach or sink, sometimes we find them floating out there abandoned, and we have to bring them in and store them and either lien sale them or destroy them. And what this bill is intended to do, it's intended to save money and environmental degradation by allowing people to surrender vessels they know are going to become abandoned to ports, designated ports that would be contracted through a memorandum of understanding to destroy those vessels before they sink or hit the beach and become environmental and financial liabilities. Just Wednesday, our Harbor Patrol Supervisor, Steve McCullough, attended a meeting of the Abandoned Vessel Advisory Committee in Sacramento, where they began hammering out some of the very, very basic details of how this program will be implemented. It's important to us because we're the only port in Santa Barbara County, and so we're concerned that all the details get worked out in terms of the MOU I mentioned, that the city would have to enter, but there are other players involved. The boatyard will have to be involved. The Marburg will have to be involved, the disposal facility. And so there are a lot of details to work out, but in the end, it's likely to be a good thing and get more abandoned vessels off the water before they cost more in terms of environmental terms and money.
Just one quick follow-up. Is it realistic to expect owners of these types of vessels to come forward?
Yes, it is. A percentage of them, I am convinced, will do that. It's like the bell curve. There are always folks that want to do the right thing.
Commissioner Owen.
Well, who's going to pay for it? I mean, I thought by reading this that this was sounded like free disposal. Is that not the case? when you turn in a vessel, what does that mean? If we make it easy, I guess it's sort of like, the free trash day with Marburg, where people get rid of all their couches in Isla Vista and that kind of thing. I mean, is that essentially what we're looking at here? And who's going to ultimately pay for it? Has there been any thought?
Commissioner Owen, great question. The assumption going in is that the receiving ports as participants in this program and gatekeepers of the program will not be spending a dime on this effort, although they're partners with a concentric interest with the state in this. The state is interested in increasing its budget at the Department of Boating and Waterways. Its Abandoned Watercraft Abatement Fund usually is funded to the tune of $500,000. They may have to borrow from Peter to pay Paul out of DBA's budget to bolster this, because it's not clear yet whether they're going to try and provide a financial incentive for people to do this as well. All that's still on the table and being discussed, and is not all of that has been fleshed out yet. But the expectation, I can assure you my expectation, and I think it's a general expectation of the receiving ports, is that this will be funded by the same entities and agencies that are helping us out with this abandoned vessel problem.
I'm glad Bill brought this up. I was going to forget it. So we've worked for years now to find ways of keeping abandoned vessels from showing up on our beaches here and crashing into the wharf and causing lots of damage. So this would be a really great part of that puzzle if there's some kind of a financial incentive for people to turn it in, and they can get rid of it without having to pay for it. Of course, with the state budget the way it is, I can't imagine anyone's even contemplating this right now, but it would be really helpful to us as a city if we made it easy for people to dispose of vessels, i.e. was paid for.
It would indeed, and I would be remiss if I didn't conclude by reminding that this bill was actually sponsored by the California Harbor Masters and Port Captains Association, of which the city of Santa Barbara is a member.
Okay, thank you, Mick. Are there any further comments or questions? Thank you for a nice report. This brings us to the new business. And Mary, if you would read it. And the way let's do this is we'll have the complete presentation, then we'll have the public comment, and then the commission will discuss it.
Draft West Beach Planning Study. Recommendation that the Harbor Commission review and consider the Draft West Beach Planning Study and provide input on the recommendations and development alternatives therein.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, as you know, periodically we have reported back to you, and you've been invited to participate in what we're calling the West Beach Planning Study. I included in the packet basically a memorandum which outlined how this began and what components of this are related to the harbor master planning efforts that we undertook many years ago, the stakeholder groups that we've been working with, and tonight I'm going to basically turn this over to Pat Saley and Janice Thompson, who have been the consultants working diligently, not only with our department, the Park and Recreation Department, and the Redevelopment Agency folks, which are funding the study. The one thing that I need to constantly remind you and the stakeholders, the study is paid for. The capital improvement planning efforts or projects or components that may ultimately be the outcome do not have funding and are not anticipated to come from the Waterfront Department, but are rather to potentially be a further phase of the Redevelopment Agency's effort, call it a phase, an additional phase of the West Beach Pedestrian Improvement Project, which is currently underway. So Pat's going to walk you through basically the final report, which all of you were provided a copy with. It's been posted online. And we did have a meeting here recently, a joint meeting of the Park and Recreation Commission and the Planning Commission, and got some comments from them, which Pat will also share with you.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. As John said, Janice Thompson and I worked on this study. We both worked on the Harbor Master Plan, which was adopted in 1996, so have been involved in harbor and Stearns Wharf, West Beach issues for quite a while. The purpose of the study, as John said, is to address issues that were raised during the process, the West Beach pedestrian improvement process. And as is inevitable when you sit down with people and talk about their interests in an area, There was a lot of interest in talking about West Beach itself, which was beyond the scope of that study. So commitment was made to do a study specific to West Beach, and we wanted to evaluate what was there presently, consider adding uses as appropriate, structures even if appropriate, and just generally improve the appearance and the attractiveness of the area. So those were our goals. The study itself has some background, talks about policies. As you'll see in a couple slides here, pretty much all of West Beach is in the Permanent Coastal Commission's jurisdiction. And so Coastal Act policies, local coastal plan, there are a lot of policies that provide a lot of guidance and constrain what really can happen on West Beach. We talk about existing conditions. We did a pretty extensive needs assessment, talked to about 50 people, total of probably 20 interviews, so one-on-one interviews more or less, and got a lot of good feedback. The draft report includes 2 alternatives, and we'd be interested in hearing from you as to which one you like or which combination, because our goal is to have just one option in the final report that goes to council. And then we do talk briefly about what it would take to implement the 2 options from a process standpoint, not getting into funding. Just briefly, the history of West Beach. I think you know that it was not a beach originally. The wall along the sidewalk was really a seawall. And in the 20s, when the detached breakwater was constructed to protect Fleshman's boat, as I recall, and then it was connected to shore, and West Beach, as we know it, was created pretty soon thereafter. And the beach is dredged back when funding allows every other year or so. That has been a real boon to the area. It gets like the little kids doing the seashell activities and outriggers and all sorts of people, gets them away from the traffic coming in and out of the harbor, and also replenishes beaches down coast. In 2007, there were also 2 requests for funding that went to the redevelopment agency relating to this area, and both of those are going to be addressed in this. One was from the Seashell Association, and the other was from the local Chumash community relating to providing housing for a tamal or canoe, and we'll be going over those in a minute. Just background on some of the policies. The map you see there is the Coastal Commission's map showing jurisdiction. The cross-hatching, like through the word harbor there, is their permit jurisdiction. They retain authority to issue permits in that area, and when you, in your mind's eye, imagine West Beach as it now exists, you can see that much of that area is in their jurisdiction. Right up adjacent to Cabrillo is appeals jurisdiction. The city does retain permit authority, but under certain circumstances, though any approvals or denials, I suppose, can be appealed to the Coastal Commission. Some of the policies, first and foremost, public access to and along the coast, and protecting the coast for recreation uses, particularly those that can only be adjacent to water or on water. Protecting sensitive habitats and views, and then minimizing risks, not placing structures or people in an area where they might suffer some harm or damage. The LCP, Local Coastal Plan, which is the city's version of the coastal plan, picks up on those policies from the Coastal Act, talks about low-cost visitor serving, views, the same sorts of issues, and then bringing it down one more level. The Harbor Master Plan had similar policies, but was more of a sort of a mini capital plan, you might say, and pretty much all the recommendations in the Harbor Master Plan have been implemented, and the volleyball courts were added after that, and Rec 1.2 at the bottom there, consider native dune landscaping between the bike path and the wall. The original proposal in the Harbor Master Plan was to put grass in that area to kind of mirror what's on the other side in Palm Park. And the Coastal Commission is very, very protective of sand. And even though grass would provide recreation space, they didn't like that, but suggested native dune landscaping. So we've put that in one of our 2 alternatives just to get some comments and see what people think. There are other city ordinances, the most important of which is the Parks and Recreation Ordinance, which prohibits any structures except restrooms and lifeguard towers. And in our research, those are the only kinds of buildings that the Coastal Commission has really considered in the last decade or so, wouldn't you say? So if a structure were proposed on the beach, that ordinance, among others, would need to be amended. We did, early in this process, informally meet with Coastal Commission staff, and it was all hypothetical, but they did give us some feedback. We tried to meet with them again before we released this report, and we're going to try before we release the final report, but they've been hit pretty badly by budget cuts. Regardless, they really like West Beach, this wide, open beach in an urban area. That's pretty unique up and down the coast. And they said, if you're going to have any structures on the beach, making them as public as possible, having educational elements would be really beneficial. And then they added the caveat, but try to avoid the sandy beach, try to avoid covering sand. We searched far and wide for precedents in the Coastal Commission's record, and there are a project in Ventura, one down in San Diego, restrooms and lifeguard towers, and they're still wending their way through the process, but it appears the staff is supporting those projects. Lots and lots of studies are necessary before anything could ever be placed down there, and on the slide are some of the studies that might be necessary. West Beach today, I think you're familiar with this. It's getting a lot of use, which is great. Bottom left, that's Arlington West with an aircraft carrier in the background. Some of the other things, lots of outrigger use, sailboats, Shumash once or twice a month come down with their tamal that is stored now at Aurora Borough Beach, youth sailing, volleyball, sparkle, music concerts or festivals, and then a lot of passive activity, just beach sports. It's a little hard to see, but what we have on the top right are the seashell condos, and bottom right is the dredge yard. And the dark paint that's kind of hard to see right there is covering up some graffiti. That fence gets tagged quite a bit. It's pretty close to Cabrillo. It makes it sort of in and out very easy. And we heard a lot in our interviews about the appearance of the dredge yard, and everybody recognizes it's very necessary, but the consensus was there has to be a better way of presenting that and having that area be less industrial in appearance. You know about these improvements. They're making progress on these. When we met with the stakeholders, we sort of review what's being proposed so people understood this would be considered a given when we talk about the future of West Beach, signage in particular, relating to that area. Some of the other things, this is a night heron in the Myoporum trees right along the sidewalk next to the boat launch ramp. There's snowy plover foraging areas. There are some natural resource values in this vicinity, something that would have to be addressed before anything would be proposed. Okay, the needs assessment. We talked to about 50 people. There was a lot of unanimity, if not consensus, and there's a lot of people in this community really, really like that beach and that area a lot, and everyone agrees it could have more life breathed into it and could look better, but it's definitely something that is near and dear to a lot of people. Again, everybody recognizes dredging is necessary, but maybe the dredge yard could look a little more aesthetically pleasing. There was interest, like the hotel and restaurant owners, for example, are very interested in more activities for like festivals and sparkle and all that kind of thing. On the downside, it makes parking difficult for sort of the regulars that go down there, so there's some trade-off there. Seemed to be consensus that the outrigger storage area, particularly the one over by the rock groin, could be upgraded and look a little better. There's a lot of opportunity for education and sort of interpretation of what the history and the use of the beach. And there was also interest in bringing in the larger area, and Plaza del Mar, which is across from Los Baños, and the Pershing Park, and then the art show, which is down the other side of Stearns Wharf. Maybe more things like that could occur along West Cabrillo and then in the West Beach area. So we came up with 2 recommendations. This is the one that is more, less significant. It doesn't really include structures. It's moving things around some. Up here where the dredge storage yard is currently, if we moved some of the boats that are stored down there, some of the outriggers, put them around it, then the view from Cabrillo as you come along there would, instead of looking at a chain link fence, you'd be looking at boats, which is more in keeping with the area. Down here, the outrigger area, we could have like some guidelines about colors, and there's things that can be done, or it could even go as far as the city providing racks and such, and for the people who have the permits to store their outriggers or boats or whatever. The same would apply over here, the kayak area near Stearns Wharf. And the other, let's see, both of these options assume that there'd be more signs, interpretive signs, kind of like you have along the walkway on Stearns Wharf, that sort of thing. So this is the lesser, more easily achieved option. Alternative B has those same elements plus some key differences. First of all, this is the dredge storage yard, assumed to be flipped 180. So the opening would be here instead of being located right here. So access would still be pretty much the same, just turning right instead of turning left. So pulled away, again with boats and such, the small boats, ringing it to sort of conceal it. This end obviously would have to be kept open. And then in this vicinity, either an open-ended halle, which I'll show you a picture in a moment. It's a storage area for outriggers or canoes or anything of that sort, and or a tamal house. And a tamal, again, is a Chumash canoe, and the house, I'll show you a picture in a moment. But one or both of these structures right here, so they are visible from Cabrillo, and at a diagonal so that the view, like from Plaza del Mar, for example, would not be obstructed. But just bringing more activity and interest to the area to draw people in. And the other thing, difference between alternatives A and B, is the native dune planting along here. And in the interest of full disclosure, the Parks and Rec Commission and staff were pretty concerned about that just from a maintenance standpoint. Once established, it would probably maybe diminish the amount of sand that ends up on the bike path, but that's, from a maintenance standpoint, that's an issue for them, and we recognize that, but we just wanted to include it to see what sort of response we got. This is an outrigger halle. This is from Maui, but you can see all the way through, so it both stores canoes, outriggers, whatever, and can serve as a meeting place. That's like a picnic bench in there. So it has a dual purpose. It would obviously be open to the public. This is a cross section of that. No, there wouldn't likely be horses on the beach, but that was the version we had to use. And then here's a tamal and an artist's depiction of a tamal house, and typically made of redwood with like whale ribs and things like that. The concept that was presented to us is that it would not be open to the public under 24/7 the way the Hale would, but would be open on weekends, and the public would be invited in and have a whole educational component. So that's the concept. Some additional recommendations that we've listed and haven't shown on the two plans is the idea of like a small commercial area for beach rentals. I was in Santa Monica last weekend, and there's a lot of that kind of stuff, but on a much lesser scale. The concept of like the first Thursday they have downtown, where businesses and eateries and such all get together, and it's a draw for people to come down there. Maybe something like that could be done. Expanding the arts and crafts show or something similar to the west side of the wharf. And then there was interest in studying the wading pool area, a splash pool, all sorts of ideas came up, and that was really beyond the scope of what we were doing, but we were trying to capture these for posterity's sake, if nothing else. So we had a meeting last Thursday with the Planning Commission and Parks and Recreation Commission. 10 of the 14 commissioners were there, and we received in the couple of days prior to that meeting 14 emails all supporting Alternative B with the Outrigger Hale and the Tamal House. There were 5 speakers last week, mixed support. They varied. Pretty much everyone is interested, I think this is unanimous, in increasing public use of the area. And then the Seashell Association gave us a CD with PowerPoint on it. Doesn't happen that often. And here's a couple pictures from the CD just showing how the condos are used, and here's a repair project. The essence of their comments, and they're here, they can certainly speak for themselves, but Alternative A, the lesser one, we had said, well, maybe the condos can move to accommodate the dredge storage area or vice versa. We sort of left it both ways, and they said it seems it's a whole lot easier to move the dredge than the condos, and I think they're probably right. And then they recommended that Alternative B be modified, and we've got this here. They're suggesting, and it's hard to really see the underlying plan, but this is the same as Alternative B with a cutout here of a small boat yard, so a fenced area that they would like to see used, where they could store things, do some of their rigging and such. And again, I'm sure they'll speak to this tonight. So that is their suggested modification. And then the Planning and Parks and Rec Commission's comments. Of the 10, they were about split equally. Those who thought Alternative A, the lesser one, was the best. Those who really liked B, and then there were some who thought, oh, maybe we do A first and then sort of phase into B. I think universally they all thought A would be good. It's a question of, do you go farther? And that some of the issues they raised related to Alternative B, the one with the Outrigger Hale and the Tamal House, was covering the sand for a private use that's only, limited public use might raise some issues. The approval process to put those structures there would be considerable. And then funding availability. Definitely structures just are significantly more expensive than just rearranging things. And then generally other comments, there was a lot of discussion about maintenance and concern about not creating any additional demands on the maintenance staff, if anything, reducing that. Making sure everything is coordinated with the West Beach project, so there aren't duplicate displays or interpretive displays. They like the ideas of additional events to bring people down to the area, and then there was some interest in looking at the wading pool area over near Los Baños. And then just to conclude, as we mentioned, this study with 2 alternatives, our goal is to release an administrative final study in a month or so with just 1 alternative. So your comments are important to us, as are the public comments. Realistically, I think we're looking at going to council in early 2010. John's shaking his head. And then any comments could be sent either to John or me. There's our emails, both of us tonight. We like to hear from people. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice, detailed presentation, and I must say the packet took some reading. It's quite long, quite thorough, and guaranteed to put you to sleep if you have a little insomnia and you try and do it all at one shot. Are there any, before we go to comments or questions amongst the commission members, why don't we take our public input, and we'll start with Jim Muir.
With seashells.
Okay. It's fine. So we'll do Paul Castleberger, okay?
I had actually made the charts that I guess I could plug in if you want. How long do we have for this? Or
Since there are 5 people that are going to speak, and then I don't know how much the commission wants to do, so let's try and, I don't know what kind of a presentation you have. What do you think you need?
5 minutes?
We can probably go 5.
Is it possible to plug this in? Does anyone know how to do that? No. Okay, I'll just talk.
There you go.
All right. Then I probably won't need quite so much time. Actually, she put up a slide for me. First, I just want to thank the John Bridley and the Waterfront Department. They have been a tremendous support for the Seashell Association. I didn't properly introduce myself. My name is Paul Castleberg. I am the outgoing Commodore of the Santa Barbara Seashell Association. I suspect most of you are aware of the Santa Barbara Seashell Association. We've been in existence for over 60 years in Santa Barbara, teaching youngsters to sail, ages 8 to 15. It's a family organization. It's very family-driven, family-run. We're a nonprofit group. We do all our own fundraising. We take care of the condos. We manage a couple of small skiffs for chasing kids down who are in need, and sometimes chasing ourselves down when we're in need. We have about 50 families in the organization, over 60 skippers, and it's quite an amazing process to see at the beginning of the year. New families and new organizations come in who don't know anything about sailing, and by the end of the year we've got kids sailing backwards and forwards and doing everything single-handed in a boat, and it's really a magical process to see. The seashell condos are something that are an enabler for our club. They really expand participation in the club. They allow families who don't have storage at home to be participants. They are able to store boats on the beach, and we have ease of access and doing things down there. So they're really important to our operation and what we do down there. The ease of access from the condos to the launch ramp is very important. We had one day at the end of the last year where we foolishly tried to sail in high winds and found ourselves trolleying the boats from West Beach across the soft sand back over to the condos, and that was quite an endeavor and something we wouldn't want to do every weekend. So having them close to the cement and being able to walk around is important. And on the little diagram I put here, the yellow was meant to be a hard walkway, not necessarily cement. It could be decomposed granite or something like that. Just something because we have big wheeled trolleys that we roll along. On the prior slide that they had stole from me, if you go back to that one real quick, every year we do maintenance on our condos. These photos are from last year, and we had 2 major undertakings that we did there for some work. And the first one was to re-roof the condos, and we did the ones nearest the beach there. And we tore off the plywood and put in, re-roofed the whole thing. So that was a pretty major undertaking. I wanted to thank the Waterfront because we They let us use their dumpsters and help us dispose of things properly as we go through that process. And so that's actually a great relationship we have there. The second project was the upper picture there, and we actually modified some of the condos to accommodate 3 boats because we actually had an increase in membership this year, which is always a nice thing. So we've actually, in a year that saw a lot of economic downturn, we actually had growth and more participation in the club, which was really a neat thing to have happen. So if we go back to the other one, this was an idea we came up with. This is modified from what is the alternative B that they came up with, where one of the suggestions is that we have the condos are all in a straight line going out along a walkway to Cabrillo Boulevard. And one of the comments was maybe we can just move them away from Cabrillo a little bit and just sort of make things a little more aesthetically appealing out there. We won't deny that the color green, which Jim and I think we both wore our green sweaters tonight to remind ourselves of the condos, could be improved, and we could do things better down there. We're very motivated to help do that. We have a lot of membership that can help with things. We're not a rich club, so we would need some funding support perhaps to make them really pretty. If we go out and do it ourselves, it'll be a bunch of weekend warriors doing it, so you kind of get what you pay for in that respect. So we like the idea of creating a small boat yard. I've talked with a number of people who have the boats. There are a lot of boats, permitted boats, parked behind the condos, and being able to enclose those and have a small boat center there that we would be able to work with kind of makes some sense. The cons to that might be transients using it as a dormitory or something like that. So these are issues that would have to be addressed as we go forward in that. But I don't know, there's some sense that could be made out of that. Anyway, that's all I have. I just wanted to thank the efforts that have been going on because they've been doing a tremendous job, and we're alive and well and intend to stay that way. So I don't know. Does anyone have any questions for me? No?
No, I don't think so. All right. Jim Muir.
Hi, my name is Jim Muir. I'm the incoming Commodore for the Santa Barbara Seal Association. I'll speak very briefly because Paul covered everything very well. I just wanted to express I feel that the Seashell Association provides not only of great value to the club members themselves, but provides part of what a working harbor has, which is people interacting with the ocean. It's sort of we get frequent comments from tourists, from the public, from local residents when we're there, how pretty the boats are and how fun it is to see everyone there sailing and having a good time. And I think it's an important part of what a harbor is about. So I really appreciate the efforts everyone is making to support us, and we're keen to support any efforts and be as helpful as we can in all of that as well. And also the small boat storage. I also have a small boat stored there in addition to the seashells. I think that's of equal value for adults for sailing. It's a continuation of seashells. A lot of folks have boats there that were once in seashells, and it's all part of what makes a harbor a harbor. And I think that's all I need to say tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments from the commission on that? Eric Friedman.
Good evening, Chair Kelly and fellow commissioners. My name is Eric Friedman. I'm here representing Santa Barbara Outrigger. Santa Barbara Outrigger is a nonprofit 501c3 dedicated to the promotion of amateur athletics, especially through competitive outrigger racing. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Pat and Janice and Jeanette back there who've put in a lot of time, and the waterfront staff. Forgive me for my spiel, but they've definitely put in a lot of time, and it's been a great process to be involved with. I've been involved with this project going back probably 3 or 4 years when it first started, and it's come to the point it is today. I'm here today to ask you to support Alternative B, which has the outrigger Tommel, or the outrigger canoe hauley, and the Chumash Tommel house. Looking at the big picture, I think it's easier to start that way. Is recently, you might have seen the cover of the Independent last week. There was a picture of the Chumash mosaic that's now on part of the West Beach Improvement Project, and right across from Ambassador Park. And as we had some meetings, the vision that is out there that we have, and with the Chumash who've expressed it as well, is you go to the the mosaic, and you see the history, especially the Tummel. Those of you who have seen it have seen that it's really heavily emphasis on the canoes. And rather than seeing that and trying to picture it, all you need to do is look over 100 yards to your right, and you will see modern-day watercraft, Tummels, outriggers, right there, and pretty relevant structures compared, if you're looking at the Tummel House. I can't speak to that, but to the canoe hauler, it's what they have in Hawaii, in outriggers are the traditional canoes out there. As part of the ceremony to celebrate the mosaic, they brought in a Tummel, and one of the speakers noted that they had been in contact with some locals in Hawaii who, at the very same moment that we were celebrating here, did a prayer at one of their sacred sites in Hawaii. And there's a long tradition of different cultures and canoes coming together, especially down in that area and over time. So we have this grand picture of just having it cultural, educational, and recreational opportunities, and those two structures will definitely enhance those, and those meet some of the criteria that the Coastal Commission said would, at a minimum, need to be considered to move forward with it. In addition, we've also had, Santa Barbara Outriggers also had an exhibit in the Maritime Museum about 2 or 3 years ago about outriggers, and we even had a canoe in the Maritime Museum that was handcrafted by someone locally, and it had some koa wood, which is the sacred tree of Hawaii, and it's one of the most beautiful canoes on the West Coast. Her name's Nicolo, and she's known as the Queen of California, and she's retired now. But so there's this history there. And that's what we're really trying to promote is getting people to take that next step in line with what to get people across from the wharf over into the merchants area and promote opportunities for people to use the beach and build a sense of community. There's just a couple things I wanted to get to. Technically, in the picture of the schematic of the hallway, it's important to emphasize that there are no walls on the structure, so it doesn't block views as a walled-off structure. And there's 6 canoes that we currently have down there that are about 45 feet by about 10 feet when they're rigged. So they would go inside the hallway, and we'd be able to keep them there year-round. Right now we have to trailer them off in November and bring them back in March due to the weather and the elements to maintain them. It's difficult to keep them down there all year for those reasons. And it's also important to remember that the canoe hallway doesn't pave over the sand. It's kind of similar to a wharf, pylons, so that we have minimal concrete. I think it would only be for the pylons that go into the sand. And then as to the horse, that's on there, our architect who was drawing it, he was Fiesta time and he was having a little fun, but there's no way you could get in that structure on a horse. It's actually the actual picture that you saw of Hawaii is an A-frame, and we anticipate it being a lot lower, and it'd be just barely the bare minimum to allow people to go in and out. So then these are potential designs as well. We realize if it ever got to the point, we'd be working within the city processes. So I'd just like to ask you to support Alternative B and the larger vision we have, and thank you for your time tonight.
If I could have you hang on, Commissioner Owen has a question for you.
Eric, one of the comments that Pat brought up that the Parks and Rec Commission, and maybe it was Planning Commission, had said was the idea that these areas were going to be closed off, both the Halley and the canoe house. Would this be open for people to walk through, but where the canoes could be secured? Is that one way that we can address that?
I can't speak to the Tummel House, but the hallway would not be closed off. Right now, as it stands, anybody can walk up to our canoes at any time, and we haven't had issues with that. And this would be along the same lines. Is it would be open, people couldn't walk by, and we'd even thought about having some signage up there to tell people what they are, and ask people not to sit on the canoes, of course, but to give some history of those. But it would be open year round. For people to walk up to and see.
Yeah, I think that would be an important element to addressing concerns with closing off parts of the beach, which it doesn't sound like it would.
Yeah, and you're right, and that's why we want to keep it open. And the structure, again, it's basically covering canoes that are already there, so it's not adding the 50 by 70 foot number that's in there is not it's not additional area. It's basically covering the canoes that are already there. So.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Steve Hislop.
Good evening, Chairman Kelly, Commissioners. I'm Steve Hislop with Chuck's Waterfront Grill and the Endless Summer Bar Cafe. Here representing the Harbor Merchants Association. Skip Abed, the president, was not able to be here tonight. I'd also like to thank the Redevelopment Agency, the city, Waterfront Department, and Pat and Janice for the great work that they've done on this project. I'm stepping back. A lot of the folks who have spoken are guests of ours frequently at the restaurants, and whether it's choice A, choice B, or choice A plus B, or A minus B plus C, I don't have I don't have a horse in that race, right? But I would like to just make a couple of general points. The original, when we were first talking about this project in the Paleozoic era, a significant component of the West Beach Pedestrian Improvement Project was to help make wayfinding along the waterfront easier, clearer, and more attractive to improve that pedestrian connection between the harbor and the wharf to the benefit of both locals and our guests who visit. And that should be the overriding philosophy. And to that end, we'd like to encourage continued consideration of improvement of the appearance of the West Beach study area with an emphasis on the aesthetic elements mentioned in the report that you have, and in particular to improve the appearance of the seashell condos and the dredge storage yard, which there is general, I think, consensus that there can be improvement there. How that's achieved, smarter minds than I will have to come up with that solution, but it is something I think is important. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Steve. And our last comment will come from Cheryl Walker.
Hi. I just wanted to remind everyone that there are many different birds other than the snowy plover, who is also important, but that there's pelicans and gulls and all sorts of interesting birds that migrate through that hang out in this general area. And so whatever improvements that are made, I would hope that they would be considered. And I can't tell you how many injuries and terrible things I see out there all the time. And it doesn't just affect me and you know, bird lovers. People comment all the time on it, that it's not pleasant to see birds being, you know, having rocks thrown at them and the fishing line wrapped around them. And so if we could have signage, you know, that's really visible and clear to tourists and, you know, people coming through, just to guide their behavior and educate them about how special the wildlife is around here. And that goes for the seals too, and the sea lions. And so signage, and what would really be great is if we could find a place along the shore where the birds could hang out and not be disturbed. If there's just a little slice of shoreline somewhere, I think it would be better for everyone. Somewhere where they could poop there and people wouldn't have to walk through it, and you know, and it would be a nice place for. There's lots of birders, lots of people come by, you know, come through Santa Barbara and come to this whole general harbor area in West Beach, you know, to look specifically at the birds. So if there would be just a little piece there that's not really used, that we could maybe just guide people away from, I think that would be really helpful. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Kramer has a letter that she received that she would like to read into the record.
From Sally Bromfield, sent email to me this afternoon. She's unable to be here this evening, and I pass it on to Chairman Kelly and also to Mary. And she says, Dear Betsy, thank you for reading my comments. And it says, to the Harbor Commissioners, I've asked Ms. Kramer to read my comments regarding your commission giving consideration to the needs of seabirds at the Harbor and West Beach area when the improvement plan for this location is being discussed. I have been a volunteer with the Wildlife Care Network for many years, with personal emphasis given to rescuing seabirds in distress on our local beaches and volunteering weekly at the Seabird Rescue Pond. I would strongly urge that there be more signage, and she capitalizes that, more signage about the pier, launching ramp, wharf, and breakwater, telling people not to feed the seabirds, pelicans in particular, and reminding them that this area of the waterfront belongs to them. That is, it is their home, and we are visitors. People tend to think all of the waterfront, including the seabirds, is for their personal enjoyment. Unfortunately, the birds cannot speak to us, so we must be sensitive to their territorial needs. A sign to respect the seabirds would also be appreciated. Perhaps you will recall how many, many pelicans roosted at the Sandspit last December and January. It would be wonderful if a section of that area could be reserved, quote, just for the birds, end quote. Thank you for your consideration to my requests. We are all blessed by these wonderful seabirds who share our environment. Yours sincerely, Sally Bromfield, and she gives her address and telephone number. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. And before I ask the commissioners for their comments and inputs, and we have a discussion, I wanted to thank everybody who's taken the time to come down this evening, and thank you for your excellent presentation. It is an issue which is important to everybody, and really appreciate your input. So with that said, are there comments or questions on the part of the Commission? Commissioner Spicer, was that a yes? No. You mean we're all going to be mute up here? Commissioner Kramer.
I think Mr. Anakuchian has comments.
Will?
Well, I should probably be the last person to speak on this rather than the first, because what I say when I turn this microphone on is generally controversial. I have great misgivings about trying to preserve a broad swath of sand in what is essentially downtown urban Santa Barbara. I don't know any place that I've ever been where it works to have something called a wildlife region surrounded by people who can take incursion through that wildlife area at their own compunction. Maybe Golden Gate Park in San Francisco is an exception, but look at that park. It's not just a spread of sand. It's topography, it's water features, it's trees, it's grass, it's flowers of every imaginable sort. In a way, it's a constructed ecosystem. I don't know how you could call us something that looks like a sand-covered vacant lot an ecosystem. Oh, yeah, there's sand fleas and things like that, but I don't think that's what you have in mind when you talk about a wildlife preserve. So, I would like to see a much more elaborate planning process here. What it strikes me is how can I put it this delicately? It looks like moving trailers around in a vacant lot. The constraints, of course, are not of our doing, or are they? I mean, we can't put buildings there. Well, that's a severe constraint, sure. That means we put up things like a holly, bamboo with thatched roof, something like the Hawaiian experience. That is okay, I suppose, if you want to follow that theme through for the entire stretch of West Beach and East Beach while you're at it. Otherwise, it's going to look odd. It's going to look artificially transplanted planted. So I can't really, even though you need it, I realize you need someplace to cover these boats. This is not a solution I would regard as optimum. I noticed that in the pictures shown of the Holly, the Tomo house and so on, there were trees all around that. Did you notice? Where are the trees on West Beach? Why aren't trees being considered here? We're talking about native dune grass on an artificial beach that never had dunes, does not have dunes, cannot have dunes because the geology, the wind, the meteorology is all wrong for dunes. If you're calling it dune-like grass, well, fine, go ahead and do it. But it's not native. Let's eschew that term. That's enough for a while. I'll probably come back to this as this whole thing develops.
Thank you, Commissioner Anakuchin. Anyone else want to dive in? Commissioner Kramer?
Sure, I'll chime in. I really appreciate, Ms. Saley, this report. I enjoyed reading it and found it tremendously interesting. I do wish that you had, as one of the stakeholders, had spoken with the Wildlife Care Network, as well as the Audubon Society, because they do two different functions. And the Wildlife Care Network has intimate connection with the birds at the West Beach and also the launching area, whereas the Audubon Society, one would think also birds, but in fact they're very distinct. So just a suggestion in the future. But I don't think anyone's calling this a wildlife reserve. The fact is that the birds exist there, the sea mammals exist there. It's not a reserve per se. It's just a protection of the animals that are there, and I think they should be given consideration, as Cheryl Walker spoke of. Of these two considerations, I prefer B. I'm sorry, Eric Friedman. I hear where you're coming from of it, but I think that there should be less development on West Beach rather than more. And one of the things that bothers me a bit about alternative B is the building in the center there, which blocks the openness from the parking area to West Beach. And that, I think, would be a real problem. And what I like about it now is that there's an open view from the parking. On alternative A, I can't see why there couldn't be the grass there that you're suggesting for alternative B. Why does it have to be just one and not the other? And as far as the maintenance, I think maintenance would be a serious question. I think that anything that is done should not have additional maintenance costs, even though that would be the Parks and Rec. We've seen recently that costs that went into the Parks and Rec, in fact, were transferred to the waterfront. And so, although that is not necessarily something that would happen, it's certainly a possibility, it seems to me. And I wonder whether there could be volunteers helping paint the condos for the Seashell Association, and whether there could be an outreach into the community of people doing it. And sure, you get what you pay for, as you say, but a lot of us do a lot of volunteer work, and it's of equal quality of paid work sometimes. And as far as the dredge and the problems with that, I like the dredge, and I think that the waterfront is basically a working area. We've got to be really careful not to tar it up, so to speak, and it maybe could be hidden. I like the idea of surrounding it with the condos of the Seashell Association, and I don't see it as a real problem. So basically, where I would come down on this would be less is more, and to be sure and to give consideration to the birds, to the wildlife, and I like the thought that you mentioned education, and that would be a good way to educate about the birds, and I know also signage. That would be also very desirable, I think. This is something that the waterfront has worked with about signage. And let's see if I have made other comments in reading this. No, that's about it. The upkeep and the photos, I think, give us somewhat of a deceptive appearance of West Beach. More often than not, there are very few people there. Those photos were, I think, taken in the summer, and it's usually not particularly populated. And one comment that Cheryl Walker made, I mean, is that I've also heard, is that the effects of on tourists of seeing birds that have been injured and the rescue attempts. I think she's there maybe 4 or 5 times a week. I mean, it's a frequency there. So I think education would be really, really helpful. Basically, thank you very, very much for this report. It's really interesting.
Thank you, Commissioner Kramer. Commissioner Spicer.
I will jump in at this time. And I appreciate the passion that this topic brings up. I'm a family person, kids, my social circle, it's lots of kids, and this is never a beach we go to. It's never been one we choose to go to. So I'm all for these studies and the changes that people are recommending. I think this is a great opportunity to do something, and I think Mr. Hislop's point of making it a lot more visually attractive is very important. Personally, I lean towards option B as well. I like the recreational aspect, and I also like the historical aspect, and I fully support moving forward with these. And I appreciate Commissioner Anakuchen's point of, I find it might be a little harsh calling it a vacant lot, but I've referred to it as the Sahara because it's a big, hot, sandy beach in the summertime, and I think these changes would be very beneficial.
Thank you, Commissioner Spicer. Commissioner Owen, did you want to dive in? Okay. I have a couple of comments, and I remember back in the paleo era when this first popped up, the whole notion was we were going to do something that would improve the traffic between and the exchange of locals and tourists between the wharf and the harbor area. This was the principal reason driving this study to come into being, and was to make it attractive, because when you come to the end of Stearns Wharf, or if you're standing at the launch ramp, there is that mini Sahara, and it's not very inviting to go beyond either extreme. I kind of see it like a Monopoly game. We're moving a lot of things around, but we've almost lost sight of the original intent of what we're doing, which is to make this a inviting and friendly area that will encourage people to pass along through the outer edge of it. What happens inside it is almost a different issue. It almost becomes a subset of the original intent of the issue, which was to encourage the flow past this large area. The interest that we had originally discussed was to make a much more improvement along the walkway area that would encourage people to move in that area. And I'm a little disappointed that other than the planting of dune grass, or what Commissioner Anakuchen points out wouldn't be dune grass, I'm sure, it would end up being the Waterfront Department's responsibility to replace it and maintain it, given the current way the city is operating. And that'll be something we get to when we go to our next point. So I have a problem with that. And I'm going to, the other point is, I have concern about two other aspects. One, I can remember the big flood in the 90s when this whole area went underwater and stayed underwater for a couple of days. There was water on both sides of the seawall and going over the top of the seawall. So anything that is put out there has the very high likelihood of getting flooded. And that's not a big stretch of anybody's imagination. I have a concern about constructing something that has any kind of an enclosure that blocks view or that blocks a lot of access to the general public, other than what is already there, because those uses are already there. So that the TOML aspect, if that becomes a concern, because now there's this enclosed item. So I don't think I could support that use of the area. I hate to say it, but I sort of like the notion of, if there's a way that we can improve how it looks without changing it dramatically and moving the boxes around, I am for that. So I would tend to go back and say I like alternative A better than B, although there are a couple of elements of B that I like. I like the less is more approach to this. And there was one other aspect. If anybody's ever been down on West Beach when there's a 20 to 25 knot breeze blowing, you're leaving, because you're going to be sandpapered into oblivion. You will have to leave this beach. And that's a lot of the time in the summer. When we get the afternoon breezes blowing, the beach is untenable. There's too much sand moving from 2 feet to 6 feet in the air, unless you happen to be a sand flea. You'll leave this beach. So those would be my comments. I'm sure that'll spur some other comments. Yeah. Commissioner Owen.
You could hide in the TOML house. I really love West Beach. Especially when I lived at the harbor. That's just I loved the view out there at night, the view of the wharf. The fact that it wasn't too crowded is, for me, that was my opinion. But I do want to actually encourage the use, and I think we've done a lot of the improvements, or the improvements are in place right now to help create the nexus of traffic. And I mean, 16 years ago, I was saying we need to get some of that foot traffic from the wharf over to the harbor, because would be good for our economy. That being said, I've talked to a lot of people who are at the harbor, and these giant festivals, these huge music festivals that go on for days on end and create massive amounts of noise and traffic, are no fun for anyone who spends very much time at the harbor. So there's taking it a little bit too far, and I know that those are popular. Well, they're popular with many tens of thousands of people, but not really with the people who have boats, or at least many of them. Unfortunately, this isn't a good wildlife area, and this plan doesn't try to say that it is. It's just, I think, someplace down the line it says we should be kind of conscious of the wildlife that's there. That's all. That's all it says. And that, I think, makes sense. Slip in the wildlife somewhere. As somebody who's done Christmas bird count down at the beach for Audubon Society, I know we get there at 6 o'clock, and there's dozens of species. By 7 o'clock, when the human species and their canine friends show up, they're all gone. That's it. Gone. All driven out of the area. All the wildlife, almost all, is gone. And that's just a reality of a public beach in the middle of a town. So there's nothing you can do about that. The people do own the beach from a legal standpoint, and they take precedence over the wildlife every time. I think some consideration should be made for the animals that are down there. They're kind of special too. Basically, I'm pretty attracted to option B. I think maybe encouraging more local use down there, in spite of what I said about the fact that I liked the fact that it was kind of quiet when I was hanging out there. Some of these options are really neat. I think what the Seashells and the Santa Barbara Outriggers are doing is wonderful. You guys are just doing really neat things in the community. There really is a long maritime history here in Santa Barbara, going back to the ancient people that preceded the Europeans. There were canoes going up and down our coast here for thousands of years, and I think it's really a neat thing to remind people of that and provide some education, some interpretation to let people know the kinds of activities that were happening here. I mean, these canoes were right up there with the Polynesians. The people who ran them were right up the Chumash with the Polynesians as far as sturdy, seaworthy Aboriginal watercraft. They're really considered some of the top-notch in the world, and they happened right out of here in Southern California in the Chumash territory and the Gabrielino territory as well. So I'd like to see some more education along those lines myself. I think any kind of structure that you're going to build on the, or erect, I should say, on the beach is going to have to address the fact that you can't, the coastal policy says that you can't close things off. So that's why I asked about the holly, and I think that'd be a real neat thing. It's something you could walk through and you can see through it. And I think the trees were mostly supposed to be in the background for some of these illustrations. They were showing, not that one, that's a picture, but like the Tomal House is showing the palm trees along Cabrillo Boulevard, I think, is the trees what those are. Unfortunately, I don't even think our non-native Myoporum would survive on the beaches down here. There's no water. This is not a tropical climate. You can't grow trees on our beach. So even if you're into that, I don't think you can. Now, speaking of plants, I don't know how we got to dune grass. It's dune plantings. There's a lot of different species that grow on beaches locally. And native is a term meaning plants that weren't introduced prior, by Europeans, basically. So we're talking, and that's all that means. Yes, I suppose it is an artificial beach well in that it didn't happen until the breakwater was put in, but it is a more or less stable beach right now. What's going to happen if grass isn't going to be the alternative, then it's going to be ice plant, and that stuff is god-awful. I'm talking about a maintenance headache. That stuff grows so fast, and it is so ordinary and, I think, ugly, and you constantly have to get in there and trim it. One of the advantages of there's a whole host of different species I won't go into them that grow on dunes locally, is that you don't need to water them, and you hardly have to maintain them. They grow very slowly once they get established, and there is a curve in which that happens. You do have to kind of give them a chance to get established and not trample them. They grow themselves. That's one of the neat things. Ask anyone who knows anything about native plant horticulture. It's almost maintenance-free planting. So I really think if you've ever gardened with them, you'll know that, and that's a major reason why we should do that. The other major reason is these plants used to be really prevalent up and down the coast, and it's another opportunity to educate the public about what was once here, and it's not just all in the past. There are places on our coast where these still grow in abundance. It'd be nice to have them in there just as a wonderful educational tool. Just talk to anyone at the Santa Barbara Botanic Gardens about how neat it is to garden with native plants. That is what I had written down. Thank you. So I think alternative B is probably our best bet.
All right. Any further comment from the commission?
Yes.
Commissioner Anakuchin.
Having gotten my second wind here, with regard to the plants, I took issue with the appellation dune, not necessarily native, so I suppose if you go up the coast and pull up some plants that are growing there, they probably were native, and you can transplant them, and they're still native. But if you pull them off a dune like at Guadalupe and try to plant them down here, I don't think they'd survive because they're accommodating, or they are accommodated by dunes and not by a rather inert beach. But I have some notes as I read through here that I'll comment on, and they're not necessarily related. They just come up on the pages in the order that the pages came up. Starting with your list of in the background, talking about the Harbor Master Plan policies, I read down through that list of what looks like about almost 20 items there. I noticed there's nothing in here for the the enhancement of businesses in the region. They're all for providing for the public. As close as you ever get to anything commercial is nonprofit. This group up here is a business. We're an enterprise. Our revenue is what we operate on, just like any other business. So it's disturbing to me to see that that topic is in no way addressed here. And you can summarize that by saying this is all very good, but what benefit accrues to the waterfront department? Some of these things are a little bit puzzling. The informal Coastal Commission input. Last item there says avoid sandy beach. What does that mean? Isn't that what we're dealing with here? I suppose there's an explanation for that, but it doesn't spring out of the page at me. And then later on it said no future revetments. What happens when the former seawall along Cabrillo decomposes, as it will, if there are to be no future revetments or anything that could be construed as a revetment? Then later on in Roman 4 topic, where you list what works and then later on how it can be improved, it's particularly noteworthy that what works seems to be easy parking. And parking is mentioned elsewhere as a desirable property and desirable quality of this plan. And yet I don't see any parking places shown on any of the diagrams. I would suggest that the area just east of the launch ramp would be a dandy place for a parking lot. Those of you that are about half my age, maybe, might have gone to Hawaii, to Waikiki, back in salad days, where you'd walk down Kapiolani and you just walk into a hotel, uninvited, you're not registered there or anything. You'd walk in the hotel, go through a very, very delightful lobby, right onto the beach on the other side. And the whole effect was entrancing, transforming. You were really in Waikiki, you were really in Hawaii when you emerged out of that hotel onto that beach. There was no restriction to anybody. There was no restriction to animals that could run in and out of there. Of course, they weren't the kind you would want, I don't suppose, but birds flew in and out. So having a building or a hotel or a structure on the beach is not a bad thing. In an urban setting, it works pretty well. And I was in Nice recently, and the effect is rather similar. True, you don't walk to a hotel onto those cobbles and pebbles that they call their beach there, but the urban presence right at the edge of the beach was not at all objectionable. Rio de Janeiro, same story. So don't be too provincial in looking at this. Take a global look at what beaches are and what beach development looks like.
Commissioner Kramer.
Yeah, I'd take a second bite of the apple. I'd like to say that one of the advantages of the waterfront department, I think, would be that the increased number of people and therefore increased number of customers and therefore an increased amount of revenue to the department. But I think more importantly, or as importantly, is that I checked this afternoon what the exact mission of the Coastal Commission is, and they would have to give the permits for any development that is done there. And the mission of the California Coastal Commission is to protect, conserve, restore, and enhance environmental and human-based resources of the California coast and ocean for environmentally sustainable and prudent use by current and future generations. And so that says to me that both the wildlife, the plant life, and the human life have to be considered. And that's just all, that's my point only. Thanks.
Kind of a mishmash, but I think that's it. Unless somebody has some other comments. I hope that is useful. I wouldn't even begin to try and summarize because that's not possible. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming down. It's 8:15, and we go on to some more regular Harbor Commission business. I'm going to ask the Commission, would you like a 3-minute break real quick? Or can everybody keep going? Soldier on. Okay. We're going forward then.
Mr. Chair, can we take those gentlemen's comments, please?
Oh, sure. John Fanick.
Commissioner, I do agree with a lot you had to say. I think that's going to have to be kind of a combination of that, and you might get a little bit of dunes if you plant the right grass and so on. There'll be an accumulation, but most of it's going to blow away for a long time. Some of the comments and concerns I have and misgivings are that I'm kind of concerned that in the marine protection.
Whoa, are you going back to what we just covered? Because I was giving you permission to speak on the topic that you had brought up at the very beginning, which was
that didn't that had no basis of what you were talking about. No, I was commenting on what you just discussed.
Right, but I didn't. Nobody else. There was an opportunity to fill out a slip on that, so I'm gonna. Okay. Somehow how this works is eluding you. So you had asked a comment on, what was it? Oh, there's nothing on here. So you had made a mention of septic or something?
Well, yeah, you were talking about the Water Commission and that type of a thing when I came in, and I thought perhaps it had something to do with that. But the reason I came here is to discuss the topics that you just covered. And I'm sorry that I didn't have an opportunity to go over this much before I filled that out.
We'll take your we'll take your comments for about 2 minutes here.
Okay, thank you. Some of my concerns with the Marine Protection Act and the abandoned vessel bill that was signed in, or is going to be, is the surrender program is probably a good idea because you'll save money on boats that do go aground, and then you have to clean up the mess. Some of those vessels could probably be auctioned and actually make some money from it. So I think there'd be a good trade-off there. With the Marine Protection Act, I'm kind of concerned that some of the boaters and anchors' rights might be circumvented in some of that. I don't know if that is a forerunner to something like that, or if something can be put in place that will be environmentally sound and yet not run people off from their rights to anchor that the federal government guarantees. Some of these new projects that you mentioned, are they going to be open to the public, or are they exclusive to some of the organizations that already exist? Or
This is a comment period, sir. This is not an open discussion for you. So if you have some comment to give to the commission, could you please do that, or I'm going to have to cut you off.
all right, as far as my comments go, well, I think some of these are good ideas, but like I said, I'm afraid that they might circumvent some voters' rights, and those will have to be considered, as far as I'm concerned, with any future endeavor.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, let's move on to the 6-year capital improvement plan.
Recommendation that Harbor Commission review and approve the proposed Waterfront Department 6-year capital improvement plan for fiscal years 2011 through 2016.
Good evening again, Chairman Kelly and Commissioners. The purpose of the capital improvement plan is to create a planning tool for developing and evaluating capital project funding needs over the next 6 years. The city charter requires that we prepare a capital improvement program 3 months prior to the submittal of the budget to council. Budget's due by May 1st, so we take the capital improvement plan to council by February 1st. Normally, we have a 2-year budget, and you take a look at the capital improvement plan every 2 years. Last year, because of the budget constraints, this has been a 1-year budget, so you've seen most of these projects just as recently as last year. There's 25 projects identified in the fiscal year 2011 through 2016 CIP. 19 of the projects are carried over. 6 projects are new, and we feel that 5 of the projects we currently haven't identified any funding for. We'll talk about our 6-year cash flow projection and about reserve balances as well. 14 of the existing capital projects are considered major capital improvements. Those are projects over $100,000, frequently administered by Public Works. The largest is the Marina One replacement project, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. Marina's renovation program is an annual funding allocation that we do major repairs to marinas, specifically 2, 3, and 4, utility replacement, new docks. Parking lot maintenance program is a big project. We're going to spend $250,000 this year on the main lot. Stearns Wharf heavy timber and pile replacement. Every year we upgrade Stearns Wharf to maintain the structural integrity. And we do have a pending West Beach dredging project in addition to the one I referenced earlier. Marina One is our largest project. Phases 2 through 6 are in the CIP. Phase 2 would fund next year in 2011. 3 and 4 and through 2013 funded by a loan from the Department of Boating and Waterways for $5.5 million. Phases 5 and 6 are out at the outlying years, 2015 and 16, and we haven't determined the funding yet. We might apply for additional loan from Boating and Waterways, or we might be able to refinance our certificates of participation. Marina One, you've seen it before. It's A through P fingers. It's our largest marina. It's about 500 slips are included in that. We have several minor capital improvement projects. Those are less than $100,000. Restroom remodels, replacing hoists, a lift station at Stearns Wharf I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. Some of the sidewalk work and hand railing along the seawall, and 125 building is the building next to our offices. The windows and decking is a pretty large project that's pending in the next few years. There are 3 lift stations on Stearns Wharf, one under Moby Dick's, which was replaced in 1998. The other 2 were installed in the early 1980s when the wharf was restored and reopened to the public. This next fiscal year, we'll spend about $15,000 in design and planning, and we expect the lift stations, they cost about $85,000 each, so those will be coming up in the next few years. This is a typical lift station. This one's under the Harbor Restaurant. They're very vulnerable to waves, exposed. We're constantly trying to paint them and upgrade them, a lot of rust and serious damage in large swells. But they are very reliable, believe it or not. It's something about being made a long time ago. They made better products. We have 6 new projects that we're looking at, some of which you've sort of seen before, but we're reintroducing them. Replacing Patrol Boat 3, Breakwater Cap Repair Project Phase 4. I'll talk about that in a moment. Our maintenance shop could really use a remodel job. The space is underutilized and needs some work. And we really need to look at installing some elevators in some of our 2-story buildings. And then the Waterfront Center, there's a renovation project proposed, which I'll talk about in a moment as well. I'll talk about it right now, as a matter of fact. The renovation project is something that will cost us about $75,000 next year, and it's a deck remodeling or renovation that's been proposed by several of our tenants, putting up some windows around the side and some awnings to keep it a warmer, more protected place, and also painting the building, and that's going to cost a considerable amount of money. And it's the tenants, the waterfront grill, the waterfront department itself, and the museum are normally involved in these types of projects. We do have criteria for prioritizing projects. We like to finish projects that are that are phased out. Structural needs, maintaining utilities, improved efficiency, meeting building code standards, including Americans with Disabilities Act, council policy, and we do get public input occasionally that helps us generate projects. We do Scott's going to elaborate a little bit more on this, but we do a cash flow model, a 6-year cash flow model, and currently it looks like some of the projects in the outlying years we'd have to find some alternative funding or increase revenues. That's the breakwater cap, phase 4, which is this curve section right here. We've done all the straight section, and the curve section is not too bad, but we do need to replace it eventually. Patrol Boat 3, the aluminum boat here, has been a bit of a problem for us, and 6 and so years out from now, we're concerned about its reliability, and some of the other projects were the elevators. We haven't identified funding for those.
Carl, excuse me, can I interrupt you? Could you go back? I was looking down, and which patrol boat is Patrol Boat 3?
The aluminum one, this one right here.
Oh, the big one. Okay.
Yeah. Scott's going to talk a little bit about some of our cash flow assumptions and revenue assumptions, and then when we're done, I'd be happy to answer any questions about any of the projects.
A belated good evening, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. I guess I'd like to start off by saying, as I always do when we introduce the capital improvement program, that this is not a budget proposal before you here tonight. As Carl mentioned, it's a start. And we look at the capital projects before we go into our budget development process in February, March, and April. But Carl's named the projects, listed the projects off. We do like to superimpose those onto our 6-year cash flow model so you can get a feel for how it affects our reserve balances in the outlying years. In your packet, there are 2 scenarios of that 6-year cash flow model in great detail. We don't have the ability to produce it in that level of detail on the PowerPoint before you tonight, but we will look at the bottom line, the reserve balances. In terms of revenue assumptions, before we look at the reserve balances, these are the same revenue assumptions and fee increase assumptions that you saw at the April Harbor Commission meeting when we discussed the fiscal year 2010 budget, and these are also the same revenue and fee increase adjustments that we discussed with the council at the June 1st budget work session. And that is a 1% assumption of 1% growth assumption in lease revenue in 2011, followed by a 2% growth in lease revenue thereafter. A 4% slip fee increase in fiscal year 2011, followed by a 3% increase in 2012, and a 2% slip fee increases thereafter. $25 per foot slip transfer fee increase annually, except for the smaller 20-foot slips. We dropped that several years ago. And 1 to 2% growth in parking revenue annually, 1% in 2011 and 2% thereafter. Next one. In terms of expense assumptions, as we discussed during last year's budget, we will be experiencing a 5% salary furlough in fiscal year 2011. No, we're not anticipating any increase in salaries and benefits in 2011. And the model does assume a 3% increase in salaries and benefits on 2012 to 2016. We've added a 2.5% inflation factor in supplies and services throughout the model. And, of course, we've accounted for the debt service on the $5.5 million loan from Department of Boating and Waterways for the first 4 phases of Marina One construction. And that loan is, again, as I believe most of the commissioners are aware, is a phased loan. So we only begin to make payments on the amount that we borrow. We don't start paying the whole debt service on the $5.5 million next year. In terms of our operating reserve requirements, we do have a policy reserve requirement of maintaining 25% of our future year operating budget in our operating reserve. So that's first priority, is to maintain 25% of our operating budget in a reserve for economic contingencies. And the Harbor Preservation Fund, per the municipal code, is required to be maintained at a minimum of $2 million. Between $2 million and $5 million, the interest generated on that fund is required to go back into the Harbor Preservation Fund. There's nothing wrong with having more than $5 million in the Harbor Preservation Fund. If we were to achieve more than that, then the interest generated from that could flow into the operating fund. But between $2 and $5 million, it has to flow back into the HPF. So our goal is always to keep the Harbor Preservation Fund at or above $2 million in the outlying years. So for the 6-year cash flow forecast, this is on the operating side. We look at our revenue and expenses from fiscal year 2011 to 2016. You can see that revenue, expense after revenue, we're looking at a net gain of $900,000 in fiscal year 2011 to $645,000 net gain in 2016. We have a variety of capital projects, and the reserve balances are along the bottom, what we expect to have following those capital projects. Next. This is the first of the two scenarios that are in your packet and that we'll talk about tonight. In the first scenario, with all projects funded, including Boat 3, the harbor maintenance shop upgrade, the 2 elevators, did I get them all? As you can see in the outlying year on the bottom line, the Harbor Preservation Fund drops below the $2 million mandate, where it's there in red for you, $339,000. So this would be if we were to pay for all of these projects that we just looked at. Go to the next one. So that's why we took $1.9 million worth of projects off the table for the purposes of the second scenario. And as you can see, if we do not proceed with Boat 3, the 2 elevators, and the harbor maintenance shop remodel, we would be able to maintain under these scenarios the Harbor Preservation Fund above $2 million, about $2.2, $2.3 million. So in terms of next steps, in January we'll typically bring you the mid-year budget review with the revenue forecast, how we forecast out with 6 months worth of data. We'll forecast out where we think our revenues will be by year end. And moving into February, we'll bring out a budget overview for your consideration. And then in March and April, we'll bring a more formalized budget recommendation. And as most of you will recall from last year, during that time, depending on how our revenue projections are looking, we can move these capital projects around, drop some if need be, or add them if something wonderful were to happen and we were to exceed revenue expectations. And that concludes my portion of the report. It looks like Mr. Bridley would like to add.
Thank you, Mr. Bridley.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, I digress a little bit. The room was not full, but there were a number of people here, as you know, and we were talking about West Beach and the possibility of projects and programs that could be built there, all of which were not to be funded and there's no identified funding for. And when I look at this sheet of paper and I added up the capital improvements for the next years, I think it adds up to be about $15 million that we expect to spend, and yet no one's here to give you input about how we should proceed. I find that ironic. I understand that some of this is mundane. I know some of this is annual, some of this is maintenance, but this is the bread and the butter of what we do at the waterfront, which maybe is unfortunate and may be beneficial, but I digress a bit. What I did want to point out is much of what you see here this evening is stuff that our projects and programs that we have gone over last year as part of the budget process. But because we're in one-year budget policy mode where we're adopting a one-year budget rather than a two-year budget, we're back at this again this year. And what staff did is look again to make sure what we presented in the 6-year CIP, the capital improvement project list, were still projects that we needed to pursue. I asked them then to look at things that maybe they didn't include previously that should be brought to your consideration. And then, of course, Scott and his staff run the magic numbers to say how much can we afford and which ones should we prioritize. So the goal here this evening is not to go through each individual project, although we'll certainly answer any question that you have about them. But I didn't want to short present what are a lot of projects, and we're certainly willing to go into them. But I know at least a majority. I don't know if Commissioner Spicer really has had as much of that as the rest of you have, because he wasn't with us last year when we went through the budget process. More than welcome to answer any questions you have about what's on this 6-year CIP. As Scott pointed out, it's not a budget. It's a one-year bite at the apple. That's the only thing that we're looking at, is what next year's projects will be, and dependent upon the economy, we may have to amend or change this again next year. So I just wanted to touch upon that before we get your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Commissioner Anakuchin.
Yes, I'll try to make this as brief as I can. On the CIP for 2011 to 2016, there are 2 elevators mentioned here at $350,000 each, which seems excessive to me. I don't buy elevators all that often, but it seems that the breakwater lights, of which there are quite a few, are only $325,000. So can you explain why that number seems to stand out heads and shoulders above all the other ones?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Anakuchin, this may come as a surprise to you, but I actually believe that they're underestimated at $350,000. In order to put an elevator into a building which doesn't have an elevator in it, it's an architectural feat to add it in a way that makes it look like it was not just stuck on or added on to the building. So much of what the cost is not the mechanics of lifting people from one floor to the other, although that is expensive by itself. The Yacht Club added an elevator to their building 5-7 years ago, and it cost them close to $700,000. So we've got this in here as a placeholder. We'll certainly have to do more work architecturally if we can find the funds to proceed, but we are under some pressure to make our structures ADA compliant. In terms of why their costs are high, I think you have to bear with that it's more than just the equipment. It's remodeling the building so that it looks architecturally part of the structure.
Well, Mr. Bradley, there are elevators in a lot of the posh hotels around the world that do have the elevators outside. It's a plus. Actually, they're all glass. You can see everything. Have you considered making it look like it was just stuck on the outside of the building? Maybe you can effect a cost savings there. I'm being facetious, of course. This is not facetious, though. The dollar against the euro is now $0.50 and dropping. Has this been taken into account in this kind of a projection? The fact that you can put an inflation figure in there is good policy, but you're inflating money that is losing its value, I think, a little faster than 2.5%. So you might want to look at the global money markets as you get into this a little deeper.
Commissioner Owen.
Yeah, is there an ADA requirement for the elevators?
Yes. The city undertook a consultant study to look at all city facilities and identified those that need to be kind of more or less immediately upgraded. We don't have a trigger point that forces us to do this at this time, but I think it'd be unrealistic for us not to anticipate in the future that this may be something that will be forced upon us.
Any other comments? Okay, I have just one or two. Carl, since it comes in the next year, 11, the West Beach dredging, the $325,000, that is a potential that we could save that to our bottom line. If you had to flip a coin and give me odds that we don't have to pay for the dredging, that somebody else is going to do that for West Beach, what do you think they are?
Chairman Kelly, they're looking kind of good, actually. Well, this project was identified years ago. It's kind of started in an outlying year, and now it's going to be next year. But if this project with Parks Department works out, there's a reasonable chance that number could at least be reduced significantly. We target the same area, and so it's one of the benefits of the project to us is to get rid of that sand with somebody else's money.
Okay, excellent. I only have one other comment, and then we do have to give you a recommendation, I think, on which one of these we want you to move forward with. And that would be, what am I trying to say here? The waterfront renovation, which shows up, that is what we saw on the slide, that it would include the painting and the panels and is that what the $75,000 covers? Excuse me.
It covers our share of it, which would be the painting of the building.
Okay. Excellent.
Mr. Chair, just a point of clarification in addition to what Carl added, and this is something that will likely come to you right after the first of the year. We're currently in lease negotiations with the Waterfront Grill folks for an amendment to their lease, primarily to address the capital improvement that they plan to make for that outdoor seating area. All of those expenses will primarily be the responsibility of the Waterfront Grill. However, as part of our lease, we allow them to take credit for capital improvements that are a long-term investment to the building. So there will be some offset in their rent as part of that, which means we're partnering or paying for it. And we will explain those lease negotiations once we've completed those with the tenant. An obligation that we have, or a component of that, is when they went forward to get the Architectural Board of Review approvals, they asked that the building be considered for repainting a different color other than the white stucco and the red tile roof. They went back to the historic color that it was some time ago, and I think some of you are familiar with that. It was kind of an off yellow-brown color. That was approved. It's not quite as draconian as the what we want to call the Railroad Depot brown. So we've gotten approval to do that. We do get common area maintenance payments from the tenants. They will, in effect, be helping us pay for these improvements. But we hadn't appropriated the money for this purpose until we knew this project was going to move forward. So in essence, it's not new money. It's money that we've been getting from the tenants to repaint and refurbish the building over time.
Okay. Thank you, John. And I did have one other point, and that is picking up on Commissioner Owen's thing about, it's in the out years, the elevators. What are rather than spend the almost $750,000 to make it possible to take a handicapped person to the second floor, wouldn't it be more cost effective to whatever those functions are that they have to attend, move those functions to the first floor over the long term? Or is it just the fact that there's a second floor, so you have to have an elevator?
The latter. It doesn't matter what the function is. The building needs to be fully compliant for accessibility if there's any use or activity up there. So under the first scenario, you'd literally have to take everybody that's on the second floor and put them on the first floor. Then we wouldn't need an elevator, but that wouldn't be the same building.
Okay, understood. Commissioner Owen.
And the case would also be like Brophy's. Brophy's, you currently can't get to the second floor via an elevator. Right. So eventually there are people that can't really go up to Brophy's that aren't ambulatory enough to go up the stairs. So it
Could they
is an
possibly
issue.
be served by that little insert area down below?
They can, but the goal of ADA is that to allow everybody to have the same opportunity
The
to
Brophy's
be on the
experience
second
is
floor.
upstairs, Johnny. Come on.
Okay.
It's like you'd have to be able to. It's
Okay.
like you'd have to be able to anticipate ahead of time, what activities disabled people are likely to use or not. But anyway, I understand. I appreciate your attempt to problem solve. Back to your earlier and prefacing, Mr. Bridley. Thank you for bringing up the funding for all of these really neat options that we all think are great. We ought to go for it. We'd really have to, I guess, I don't know, has anyone stopped to talk about where funding for this would come from? Because first off, I don't know why it would come under the waterfront department when West Beach is really, under the jurisdiction of the Parks and Recreation Department. The other thing is that we got nonprofits who want to use these facilities. Some of these are very, educational in nature or have that side to them. So grant funding, I think, would be something that should certainly be pursued. And that they are, I know the seashells themselves, of course, they're all out of the room when I bring this up. The seashells themselves said, if there was some real substantial upgrade, they couldn't just come up with the money themselves. But as a community, I think we could probably come up with grant funding for something like this, or at least I'd hope so. As far as the recommendation goes, you've got several options there. The recommendation is to approve the program. I guess part of the program is just realizing that there's options and there's further decisions to be made as the economy plays out. Is that correct?
I think I understand your question, and I think the answer is yes. The intent of this evening was to get your feedback. We certainly wouldn't recommend you a 6-year CIP that didn't balance or didn't have a $2 million harbor preservation fund at the end of 6 years. You could mix and match current projects and take some of the ones that are unfunded or expected to be unfunded and move those in if they were more of a priority for the commission. We wanted to make sure that what we were more or less looking at made sense, meaning there are some that probably can't fall into the 6-year picture yet because we just don't have the money. And we would obviously look to putting forward a 6-year CIP that we believe balances along with the policy requirements of the Harbor Preservation Fund.
Okay, and then another follow-up. It seems like the patrol boat at this point, it's a new project. New projects, I think, kind of get put off anyway. But it seems to be like one of the things that would come off the list. We could talk a lot about a patrol boat, I think. First question is, first is a comment. I believe we need to give the Harbor Patrol really top-notch, excellent equipment because they do incredible things with it. And you've all heard me talk about that before as to what these folks do to save life and limb and property. These are fire boats as well as rescue boats as well as vessel assist boats and on and on and on. So they really do need top-notch equipment. That being said, I guess I wonder on a vessel like this, and what are the conditions? What are the issues with the conditions? I know we don't have a lot of time to get into that now, but even if we were to fund a new one, it's, what did it say, 2016 or something, or quite a ways out. I mean, an aluminum boat, how far can you maintain something like that and still maintain top-notch equipment? Or are we looking at new equipment new capabilities that this wouldn't handle right now?
Chairman Kelly, Commissioner Owen, this particular vessel, being aluminum, has had a lot of problems. Well, metal boats tend to have problems with electrolysis and other things. We invest heavily in the maintenance of it. It will keep it as operational and reliable as possible, and we'll continue to do so. We always dream about what we would like to do to improve our fleet, and that's the vessel we'd like to swap out for something more reliable, something fiberglass. It comes up in our discussions every year, and it will probably until we can find funds to replace it. But we do have a very aggressive maintenance program on all of our vessels, and we do make them as reliable as possible with surveys and everything else and major upgrades, if that helps answer your question.
And then just a little comment. At some point, what gets into the equation is how much would you reduce maintenance by annual maintenance on that vessel by replacing it ultimately?
We may not have those specific numbers for you, and I think as we would get closer to the need to move forward for replacement, we would certainly present a complete analysis along those lines. Carl used the word reliable. I don't want anyone to walk away with the impression that the boat is not reliable today or tomorrow or next year. If it was, we'd be asking you to move it further into the expenditure program than it currently is considered. We are spending more money than we would like to spend on an annual basis to keep it in tip-top performance and whatever condition that the patrol officers need it, and make it available every day. And it is our largest fireboat and the workhorse from that standpoint. But I really want to make sure everybody understands there's not a safety issue or a unreliability issue with the vessel. It's really a cost replacement versus ongoing maintenance issue.
Okay, thank you. Are there further comments or questions? Then we had, okay, Commissioner Owen.
I was just going to move the recommendation
Oh, which one?
to approve the capital improvement budget, the CIP. That's what it
Right,
says.
but
It
there were-
doesn't ask us to pick. That's why I asked him. I mean, it's a package.
Well, I see two of them, so my assumption would be you would have to say basically the one without the 1.9 million in the unfunded projects.
That the Harbor Commission approve and the proposed waterfront 6-year capital improvement plan.
I'm sorry. I believe the chair is correct. We did give you two alternatives, and just to make sure they're absolutely clear, I think it's attachment 1, if I remember right.
They're not numbered.
I think they're. Oh, they are? Okay. So let's get specific here. It would be.
They both say attachment 2.
Well,
That's why I was asking you that.
It's a good
question
question.
earlier.
Okay. So your motion is that we approve the one that has the 1.9 million in the unfunded projects up in the top?
I withdraw my motion right now until I look at this again.
Okay.
I'm a little. I don't know how to vote on this. I mean, it's all. We got to get a crystal ball here. So, we have a couple of options, all dependent on the economy of the future. I'd say, my first thought would be let's approve the one that covers all the capital improvement projects that we need, assuming we can afford it. So
you want the one that has everything in it?
Well, don't we all?
The only problem is we can't go for that one because, and I'm just going to add comment to it, because it doesn't fulfill our requirements.
Excuse me, Chairman Kelly, can I add a point of clarification?
Dive in, Carl.
Prior to last year, we never presented a CIP that didn't have at least $2 million in the Harbor Preservation Fund. Last year, the city administrator asked us to identify unfunded projects, and therein lies the confusion. You're used to seeing CIPs presented to you fully funded and budgeted. He wants us to identify unfunded projects now. So 2 years ago, you wouldn't have seen these unfunded projects. The balanced budget one is the very last page on Exhibit 2 that says 1.9 million unfunded projects at the top. It's the very last exhibit you have, if that helps.
And that's the one that you're proposing?
Yes.
Correct. Okay.
We're going to include, as part of it, the unfunded list, but we would not incorporate that into our budgetary planning or 6-year projection.
Crystal clear.
So to make sure it's crystal clear, then even if we supported that, obviously you're not going to drop below reserve balances. Not consciously,
Again,
anyway.
It's not something we do on an annual basis. We'd be looking at revising it as we go forward.
Okay.
In that case, I would move approval of the last page in attachment 2, the 1.9 million unfunded projects one.
Is there a second to that motion? All right, Commissioner Anakuchin seconds it. Any further discussion on the part of the commission? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? I think that passed unanimously. Whew. Now we go to the proposed lease agreement with the Boat Launch Mini Mart.
Recommendation that Harbor Commission review and recommend to the City Council approval of a 5-year lease agreement with one 5-year option with Boat Launch Mini Mart LLC for the 536-square-foot convenience store located at 305 West Cabrillo Boulevard at a monthly rent of $1,600 or 6% of gross sales, whichever is greater.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, the Lawrence family has operated the Boat Launch Mini Mart since assuming the lease through an assignment process in 2003 from Skip Abed. As you may recall, it was formerly known as the Gedunk Mini Mart there at the launch ramp. Mark Lawrence has a corporation, Boat Launch Mini Mart LLC. He primarily focuses on his energies on his other businesses, and his folks, Richard and Dolly, operate it on a day-to-day basis. So it is a family-run operation. As Mary indicated, the term of the lease is 5 years with a 5-year option. The rent is $1,600 a month, subject to the annual CPI. Percentage rent is the base rent, or 6% of gross sales, whichever is greater. This is a marginal business at best. It rarely breaks into percentage rent, really due to its geographical location. It's way back in the harbor lot next to the launch ramp. Its main market is the occasional boat launch user, marina liveaboard, but mostly Los Baños kids during the summer youth programs. That's when they make their good money there. The permitted uses are for the retail sale of prepackaged food, beverages, and so forth. It has not been our goal to turn this into a restaurant. We've had many proposals over the years to glass in the surrounding patio and start selling pizzas and things out of the place. And it's really designed to be a convenience store and not a restaurant facility. Basically, the business terms and conditions are identical to the current lease. And Mark Lawrence has signed the personal guarantee since it is with a limited liability company. So I would conclude with that unless there are any questions.
Thank you, Scott. Any questions or discussion on this? Commissioner Owen.
Oh, I move that we commend them for sticking it out in this location. That's a pretty decent rent, really, when you consider pretty high rent, I would say, for the location. Hopefully as West Beach gets more interesting and popular, they'll get some more business. I'd move approval of the recommendation.
Is there a second? Okay, Commissioner Spicer got a yes on that. Any further discussion before we vote?
Yeah, I too would make a comment about the amount of rent, and so I'm assuming this is okay with them. I mean, I've had a hot dog there, whatever. It's nice people who run it.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Kramer, indeed the hot dogs are very, very good. I hate to admit I sample them once in a while myself. I probably shouldn't. It's kind of a neat operation in that the family operation aspect of it, and Richard and Dorothy are retired, and it's something for them to do. They're not out to make $1 million, obviously, and they really, really enjoy it. If you drop by and see them sometime, they've got the best attitude, and they're really having a good time at what they do. So,
great, thank you.
Okay, so we have a motion, a second. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously. Letter of agreement with Santa Barbara Montessori School.
Recommendation that Harbor Commission recommend to City Council approve a letter agreement with Santa Barbara Montessori School regarding a school bus stop in the Palm Park parking lot.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, it'll be just a moment while Carl queues up the PowerPoint for this one. In September of 2004, the Montessori School approached us, Santa Barbara Montessori School approached us for using the Palm Park lot as a pickup and drop-off point for their students. And what they needed was something off Cabrillo Boulevard, off of a main street, out of the flow of traffic is really what they were looking for. So it's an easily accessible spot for the parents to drop off the kids. They're always under parental supervision until the bus driver comes. And they pick up about 7:45 in the morning and come back at about 3:30 p.m. to drop off. Since it is during the school year, it's at a very down time for our parking lot. The activity does not impede our parking inventory in any way. There's no rent associated with this agreement. We're just working with the Montessori School to do this. We are covered by insurance policies, and there haven't been any claims or problems associated with this use of the parking lot. So this is just working together with the Montessori school to help them out. And that's all I have to say about that, unless there are any questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions or comments? Is there a motion? Commissioner Spicer makes the motion. Is there a second to that motion? Commissioner Kramer seconds it. Before we vote, any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously. Proposed lease agreement with Jacques Bertrand.
Recommendation that Harbor Commission review and recommend to the City Council approval of a 5-year lease agreement with Jacques Bertrand for a 140-square-foot mail center office located at 125 Harbor Way, number 6, at a monthly rent of $425.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, Jacques has operated the Harbor Mail Center in that location since approximately 1987, over 20 years. He offers 180 mailboxes, UPS service, receipt of Federal Express, and a small stamp machine. He services mostly business activity permit holders, liveaboards, slip holders, and harbor organizations such as the commercial fishing organizations a lot of times and so forth. Just a 5-year lease. We like to keep it to 5-year leases generally in the Marine Center building. $425 a month, about $3 a square foot, subject to, as all of our leases, to an annual cost of living increase. And he does pay just a flat utility surcharge of 15 cents a square foot a month in that building, as do all the tenants in the building, except for the Harbor Market, which is separately metered for utilities. We painstakingly tracked what the utilities were for several years, and we found out that 15 cents a square foot is a good average to go with, so we just made accounting easier and charged a flat rate. Again, the terms of the proposed lease are identical to the current lease, and the Harbor Mail Center is specifically identified in the Harbor Master Plan as an ocean-related approved use. And that concludes the report, unless there are any questions.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions?
Move approval of the recommendation.
Is there a second? Okay, Commissioner Anakuchian seconds that. Before we vote, any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously. All right. This was my little toy at the end. Do you want to go with that, Mary, or do you want me to fly with it?
Request from Commissioner Frank Kelly to review and discuss Waterfront Department lease audit program.
Oh, good. Ooh, the slide is, it's going to be difficult for you to get it right. What I wanted to do, something struck me, and I apologize because it didn't strike me when we were having the discussion, was basically that on a cost-benefit basis, when I was looking at some old notes, I went, we're spending over the last 5 years, what the slide basically shows you, is if we take the first 2 years out, 95 and 96, on the fees that we recovered, we're losing money in the long term. And in the last 5 years, we're losing a dramatic amount of money with what we have been paying to have our tenants audited. And we're recovering about $7,600 per year for the last 5 years. That's what the middle column will show you. In the last 5 years, we've lost $114,080. That's what we paid in audit fees that we did not recover. So my notion is, why are we spending $29,000 to recover $805? Then we've just thrown basically $28,000, almost $29,000 out. So my sense, and what I as a commissioner would say, is to try and pull this into a cost-benefit ratio and change the number of audits that we have for a couple of years and see if we can't get these two numbers more in line with one another. I don't think we have scofflaws for tenants, and that my sense is that if there's an error, because most of the time the errors appear small, except for the year 2008, I'm going to assume that's not skullduggery on a tenant's part, but an error. And so I would like to propose to the Commission that we consider lowering the number or recommending to staff that rather than doing 10 audits annually, we reduce that to 2 audits annually if the audits are $3,000 an audit, because then we can recover those costs reasonably, and we're not spending money, chasing money that we're never going to recover. That was the sense of this presentation.
Question. Is the idea here to make money on these audits? I have a kind of comment about the history of it too now that I think about it, but I'd like to see if you have any comment on that.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Owen, no. The intent of a audit program, a forensic audit program for percentage rent leases, is to ensure to the department and to a degree to the business that they're paying the percentage rent which is consistent, or the amount of rent that's consistent with their lease. It was never intended that the audit program pay for itself. In fact, quite the contrary. We would hope that it wouldn't, because that would tell us that there are people that are trying not to pay us the rent that we are doing. And as Commissioner Owen knows, and when I first came to the department, there was quite a bit of criticism that we weren't actively auditing the programs. And albeit that Commissioner Kelly, Chair Kelly has depicted it in this way, it's true that if you break it down on an annual basis, it looks like we're not recovering much. But if you look at the program as a whole, we have recovered in the term since 95 to 2009, where we are, 1995 to 2009, over $557,000. So we do still have a net gain overall. So if we didn't recover any funding from the audits for, say, the next 8 years, we still would have been a break even overall. So we believe there is benefit to the program regardless of the recovery of revenue. That would be our overall approach.
Thank you. The follow-up I wanted to say, and I I remember in 1995, 96, and the reason those numbers are so high is because, frankly, things were a shambles at the waterfront as far as, not completely, of course, but I mean as far as really staying on top of what tenants were paying, and there were some really actually fascinating forensic audits that had to go on where some of our tenants were just ripping off the waterfront department blind, because if you got a say a food service business, you know, how do you really know how many hamburgers somebody's selling, you know, unless you perform audits? And the audits were rare, or not certainly not consistent, let's put it that way. And they weren't consistent among the tenants either, which was another problem. So I think the reason that what you're seeing here is success, is basically a system that has kept honest people honest, and make sure that and in many ways really just sort of sets the expectations of the landlord as to what we should expect from people who lease from us. That's an initial thought, Frank.
Commissioner Kramer.
And I'd be interested to know what the patterns are in other waterfronts, other harbor. Are these kinds of audits standard?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Kramer, among the agencies that we looked at, for example, as I reported in the July report, the airport department audits uses an outside CPA firm to audit their major tenants every 2 years on a 2-year cycle. Santa Barbara County audits their percentage rent tenants. They have the Beachside Bar Cafe out in Goleta, the old Brown Pelican, which is now the new boathouse, the concession up at Halama, and so forth. And so they use a similar program. Ventura Harbor audits their percentage rent tenants on a 5-year basis using a third party. Channel Islands Harbor, 3 to 5 years. LA County Beaches and Harbor Department, Marina Del Rey has a similar program. Dana Point uses a third party. Oceanside Harbor does auditing, and Monterey does it on a 3-year cycle. They use their finance department. We're not going to recommend using the city finance department. Santa Cruz, no slight on the finance department, but they've got their hands full as it is. And Santa Cruz Harbor also reports an audit program, and Morro Bay we didn't get an answer from.
And do they basically, as far as you know, have a similar kind of response that because they're, I mean, the way this looks to me is though, as you say, this is a very successful program. I mean, that human nature is to cheat, I think. Or at least some human nature is to cheat. But if you know somebody's watching you or liable to be audited, you're less likely to do so and less likely to make errors. And is this so with other audits, as far as you know, the county and so forth? I mean, I don't see what the problem is. I don't. With all respect to Chair Kelly, I'm not sure why this has come back to us.
Let me dive back in again, since she asked a question that actually, since I brought this up. If you pull off the first 2 years, which were windfall years, it does not pay for itself. I'm not asking to stop the audits. I'm asking to reduce the number of audits. Everybody that files taxes in the United States is not audited. Thank God. You'd all commit suicide. And we would have a whole different tax system, because I've been audited 3 times. You would not like it. And it's not done by CPA. You have to audit yourself and bring it all. What I'm suggesting is that we reduce the number of audits so that we are not spending $3 to ensure that we collect $1. Given the tenuous nature of the funding that's happening and the revenues that are happening in the waterfront department, I'm suggesting that for the next couple of years we can save what you can easily see if you look in the years. In the first year, you could save $28,000. The next year, that would have been a $34,000 cumulative. By the third year, $50,000. If it's nothing but repeating itself, by the fourth year, we'd have saved $84,000, and in 5 years, we'd save $115,000. Just short. That's a lot of money to be spending to make sure that you're collecting your money. We're still auditing, but rather than 10 audits, do 2. Nobody knows who's going to be audited. That's up to the waterfront department. So you still accomplish the goal, but we're not throwing $115,000 out the window. If in doing audits this way for a year or 2 we discover, wow, we hit $50,000, then obviously people have reverted to their lesser inclinations, and then we would need to step up the number of audits. But if we don't hit that, then I think the audits are doing their job, which is to keep people on the straight and narrow, because you don't know when you're going to be audited. And that's the point of this, is to make it, is not make a profit at it, but to not waste money in an attempt to make sure that we're collecting all our money. That has no cost-benefit ratio, and if we are running this as a business, you wouldn't do it. Period. This would be the first thing that would get changed. Any other comments?
Yeah. Okay. First off, I should have prefaced this by saying I appreciate the impulse here. I understand, where you're coming from, and you're making some good points. I just think that if you were around, these weren't, what did you call those years?
Windfall years, because nobody had been audited in a serious way, and then they were.
But there were audits going on. They were just very few and far between. And my impulse is that that's what you want to take us back to. You don't want to take us back, but that's what's going to happen. I just worry about it. It's my corporate history coming back. That's what you pay me for. Is to kind of remind folks where we were at one time or another when we were a little bit more lax in our auditing program. I think this is showing something that's working well. We really ought to stick with it.
Commissioner Anakuchin.
Yes, since there was an allusion to the possibility that both sides of the contract benefit from an audit, are we asking the leasers to share the audit costs with us? Might that not be a good way to proceed?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Anakuchin, if there's any outstanding finding, meaning they owe us rent, they pay the cost of the audit. If their books are audited and found not to owe any balance of rent, the department pays the audit.
And what you see, if you take off the first 2 years, even with that taking place, except for 3 years out of 13, the department is paying a great deal more than we're actually collecting. So I think my whole thrust here is to save money for the department, not to reduce the revenue. And I would only make the motion that we consider this for let's consider this for 3 years. I'll make it a real motion that we can reduce the number of audits, or that we recommend they reduce the number of audits from 10, which is what I think we're doing now, right, Scott?
Mr. Chair, as a point of clarification, we're doing 8. 8. And we reduced that down. We reduced the amount of tenants that we audit down to 32. Our performance measurement program is to do 25% of businesses annually, of the businesses that qualify for the audit program. 2-3 years ago, we pared down the number of tenants that we do audit in the interest of saving money. Not to tip our hat too much, but tenants such as Madam Rosinka, for instance, never breaks into percentage rent. We started looking at businesses like that, and
know if you were going to audit her.
exactly, she knows the outcome anyway. So we have reduced it as much as we felt feasible. And then, if I might add one more comment, I have a certain equity that we have to deal with, and that is if we go audit Moby Dick Restaurant, and we don't audit Santa Barbara Shellfish and the Harbor Restaurant at the same time, we have everybody starts screaming, you're singling me out. So generally year before last, I believe we hit most of the restaurants all at the same time: Char West, Moby Dick, Shellfish, Harbor Restaurant, Brophy's, and Endless Summer. So those are a couple of other issues to think about.
I understand that, but that would be to say, gosh, somebody got audited, so you're picking on me to the federal government. Why didn't you audit everybody? And it's not an issue. Federal government's established that. It's not singling somebody out. So so I'll stop on that point. Anyway, that was the thrust of making it. I don't want to beat a dead horse, and so. Since nobody else will, I will. If it's not seconded, that's the end of that. I would make a motion that we recommend that the staff consider reducing the number of audits from 8. But let me stop before I finish this, because if it's 8 and we're there $3,000 in audit, how did we have $29,000 in fees that we paid in the last year?
Mr. Chair, sometimes the audits sometimes they're done in the year in which they're ordered, and we pay for them after they're done. Some take more than that. Sometimes it takes 1.5 years, 2 years to wrap up an audit, and occasionally they cost more than $3,700 to do one. Sea Landing,
Okay.
for instance, if we go in and look at the subtenants, Condor Express or whatnot, there's an additional $1,000 that we have to pay to do that additional forensic auditing.
Okay. So anyway, I'll go back to making the motion, and we'll find out if it flies or not. My feelings aren't hurt one way or the other. I'm just trying to save us some money. That staff take the recommendation to reduce the number of audits annually for 3 years from the current level to no more than 3 in an attempt to make this have the proper ratio for cost benefits. Is there a second? Yes. Okay, Mr. Spicer seconded it. Is there any further discussion?
I think it might be wise to include a provision regarding how those audits that are done are chosen. I would recommend a lottery base or a flip of the coin or something that makes it random, so that the appearance of playing favorites cannot be raised.
my Robert's Rules of Order now fail me, so I don't really know. Does anybody know how that comes up for discussion?
He would be basically amending or
Amending
replacing
the
your
motion.
motion with another one, so didn't sound like it got seconded.
Yeah. So you're making that motion, and unless that's seconded, that'll simply fade away. Is there a second on that? In other words, you're basically making that motion after the first motion. So if I remember my rules right, if somebody doesn't second that motion, it simply dies, and we go back to the first motion that was made. It doesn't mean the comment can't be heard. So is there a second on that? Okay, so we're back to the first motion, which does have a second.
My instinct is I don't like the idea, as you know, but more than that, I don't like the idea of us approving something like this that hasn't had a thorough review. Just this 10 or 15 minute discussion on this item is just not adequate to completely change a program that has been in place for a very long time. If this is something we wanted to further agendize, I mean, I probably won't even be here to talk about it. But, my impulse really is that, is this ultimately going to be a cost savings? Because if you send the message to our tenants that there's less auditing, and he's talking about 25% of the businesses are all that gets audited a year, so we're reducing that even further. Now we're saying really a small percentage of our businesses are really subject to an annual audit. It's getting more along the lines of what the IRS does, and we know that is not a big incentive to keep people from cheating on their taxes. So my fear is that we're sending a strong message that we're reducing. We're not going to be checking up on you.
Commissioner Kramer.
And I also will not be supporting this motion because it seems to me this is a process that has been working. The savings would be slight, and I agree with Commissioner Owen's comment about sending a message that would be auditing less than 10% of the total businesses per year. And I appreciate where you're coming from, Mr. Kelly, but I don't think it's worth, for me at least, to support it.
Okay, so we almost have a vote without a vote. Commissioner Spicer, did you have... you were just moving your hands. Okay, so any further discussion? Okay, so we have the motion, we have the second, we have the discussion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed?
No.
Okay, so it passes 3-2, if I heard that correctly. All right. Commission staff communications.
Mr. Chair, as many of you know, Commissioner Owen will not be continuing on with the Harbor Commission, Board of Harbor Commission. Next month is his last meeting. He did indicate that he would clear his calendar if we were going to have one next month. We have a couple of items that we have on the tentative agenda, and I think it would be possible to hold the meeting. I think based on the fact we could do two things. One, we could conduct business, and two, we could appropriately say our thanks and celebrate to a degree the years of service that Mr. Owen has so graciously given to this commission and to the harbor community. And with that, that would be our intent to go forward. And I spoke with Ken today, and he's okay with that, as he put it.
Okay. All right, excuse me. I got totally sidetracked there for a second. So if I hear what you're saying correctly, John, it's up in the air if we're going to have a meeting. And if we don't have a meeting, we'll probably have some function for Ken.
My intention would be to do both.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Or is there any motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay, and there's a second. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? We're done at 9:25.